Let's start. Okay, hello everyone. You're very welcome to our second global webinar, Biolaw and Global Risks, Challenges to Autonomy and Dignity in Pandemic Times. This is Erick Valdés, President of the International Network of Biolaw. Today we'll have terrific talks. Our lineup is truly impressive. But before, let me tell you something about us. The International Network of Biolaw's mission is to engender effective integration and communication between international centers of biolaw and bioethics in order to foster and deepen the study and epistemological and methodological development of biolaw by promoting congresses, seminars, new specialized journals, strategic plans for academic exchange, cooperation agreements, and the planning and extension of important international activities coordinated and led by the network. So here we are once again. Before starting the seminar and welcoming our first speaker who is ready, I want to thank to the University of Desarrollo from Chile for permanently supporting the network's activities. We're in touch right now through an excellent platform of this great Chilean university. In order to begin the second global webinar, I like asking Professor Alberto Lecaros, Chair of the Observatory of Bioethics and Law at the University of Desarrollo, to say some opening words. Alberto, hi there.
Gracias, Erick. Voy a dar la bienvenida en español a todas las personas que nos están siguiendo de la Red Internacional de Bioderechos y agradecido también de la participación de destacados académicos en este segundo seminario global de la red. Como director del Observatorio de Bioética, agradecer a mi institución, a la Universidad del Desarrollo, por dar el espacio para poder hacer esta transmisión a todo el mundo a través de VDTV. La Universidad del Desarrollo fue el espacio de acogida y de fundación de esta red internacional y por eso mismo nos enorgullece mucho el que podamos tener en estos momentos seminarios globales transmitidos a todo el mundo a través del canal de nuestra Universidad del Desarrollo. Tenemos, yo creo, un itinerario sumamente interesante que va a poder, digamos, dar un espacio muy rico a muchos miembros de la Red Internacional de Bioderecho. Así que yo no ocupo más tiempo y doy espacio e inicio a nuestro seminario global.
Ok, muchas gracias, Alberto. Vamos a dar unas instrucciones para que ustedes puedan, el público, preguntar a los speakers, a los conferenciantes. Por favor, vean abajo de su pantalla, existe una, digamos, paletica que dice YouTube. Hagan clic en esa palabra YouTube para que sean llevados inmediatamente a un canal YouTube en vivo, donde ustedes podrán ver también el evento, pero además preguntar como en un chat, ¿cierto? Ahora, si ustedes permanecen en la plataforma original de la UDD, no van a tener ningún problema para ver el evento, pero no podrán preguntar. Entonces, para que puedan preguntar así como en un chat, vayan al canal de YouTube. Les vamos a pedir disculpas también por adelantado, porque esta instrucción vamos a tener que darla siempre antes de todas las conferencias, porque obviamente el público puede ir cambiando o se pueden ir agregando nuevas personas. Okay, before moving on to our first speaker, here's some instructions. As we'll have talks in two languages, English and Spanish, we'll introduce the speakers and their talks in either language, depending on whether the talk is in English or Spanish. The speaker will give the talk followed by a questions and answer time. Every speaker will have 30 minutes to talk and 15 minutes to answer questions. So the audience will be able to ask questions, but you have to write them down while the speaker is talking. To do it, please look at the bottom of the screen and click on the word YouTube. You'll be taken right away into a YouTube channel where you can watch the event and write your question like on a chat. I have to warn you that if you remain on the university platform, you'll watch the seminar without any problem, but you won't be able to ask. So if you want to ask, please go into the YouTube channel right now. Please accept our apologies in advance because we have to repeat these instructions every time just before every talk as the audience can change. Okay, let's start. Our first speaker is Professor Roger Brownsword from King's College of London, United Kingdom. He's one of the pioneers and founders of European Biolaw. He's published about 20 books, most recently Law, Technology and Society, Reimagining the Regulatory Environment by Routledge in London, and more than 250 chapters in books and articles. He is the founding general editor of Law, Innovation and Technology, as well as member of the editorial board of the Modern Law Review, the International Journal of Law and Information Technology, and the Journal of Law and the Biosciences. He is honorary member of the International Network of Biolaw. Professor Brownsword's talk is entitled Beyond Biolaw, Beyond Bioethics, Pandemics as States of Exception. Roger, you are deeply, deeply welcome. Thank you very much for being with us, for having accepted this invitation. It's really important to us. Please go ahead with your talk.
Well, thanks very much, Eric. Yeah, thanks for the invitation to join the webinar. Just one small self-interested correction, if I may. My latest book is actually called Law 3.0, which was published by Routledge last month. Cheap and short. Yes. But most of the talks I'm giving these days are about Law 3.0, but it won't figure explicitly today. Today, my interest is in what's exceptional about pandemics and their relationship with concepts like autonomy and dignity and consent that are central to biolaw and bioethics. I mean, everybody seems to agree that these are special times. I've lost count of how many times people say they're unprecedented, but exceptional, yeah, and extraordinary. So, but what is it that is actually extraordinary? And here I'm going to present you with two narratives about the ordinary and the extraordinary, represented by pandemics in the extraordinary case. I mean, whereas epidemics might be part of the ordinary, pandemics, you know, part of the exceptional, extraordinary. But two stories, two narratives, which have a rather different view of how we should understand the exceptional here. The first view is a view from within biolaw and bioethics. It's a view that we can characterize the exceptional within the paradigm that we're familiar with as biolawyers and bioethicists. We don't have to step outside this paradigm really to understand the nature of the exceptional that we're now dealing with. The second account is, as you will predict, as you'll expect, a view that does step outside biolaw and bioethics and thinks it's necessary to do so to understand the sense in which this is exceptional. And if I'll of course talk through the substance of these two views in just a moment, but just to try to flag up a key difference, if I could put it this way, whereas the within biolaw and bioethics view is that, yeah, this is exceptional, is extraordinary, but we can handle this, we know what's going on here. It also implies a kind of linear view, horizontal view, where we start with ordinary or normal circumstances. We now have a firefight, an emergency, an acute problem as we deal with a pandemic. But in due course, all being well, we'll return to the normal. It might not be quite the normal that we knew before, but it's this sequence of the normal, the extraordinary, and then back again to the normal, business as usual, or more or less. Whereas the other view from outside is saying, you know, that's plausible as far as it goes, but it is a view from within the paradigm. And it's not the way that we should really understand our situation, because our situation, even in what we're calling the ordinary, combines acute and chronic threats, well, not so much acute, but chronic threats, maybe in the background, to the circumstances, to the conditions which we all need to operate as humans in our communities. the kind of essential infrastructures for human social existence. And so, although the pandemic highlights a particular acute threat, there are other threats, like fires in Australia or California, wherever it might be, that are equally acute, but equally representative of a set of chronic threats or endangering features of modern life, which can compromise these infrastructural conditions and which we need to be far more attentive to. And as biolawyers and bioethicists, although I think we're pretty good at talking about what's the right thing to do in normal circumstances, we don't really have the kind of bio-jurisprudence or bioethics that takes us to these infrastructural conditions and the importance of maintaining these conditions and dealing with compromises. So when I say maybe we are dealing with something that goes beyond biolaw and bioethics, it's in this sense that the bigger view, the larger view from outside biolaw and bioethics points to a set of conditions and a context which we have to protect above all. So this is the sort of general shape of it. And now I'll say something about both these views, both these stories, which have their own version of what's going on here and what we should learn from it, I suppose. So the first view is a view from within biolaw and within bioethics. And I'm sure we all have our own understanding of the usual patterns of debate within biolaw and bioethics. Certainly in bioethics, I'm sure the common starting point would be that what exactly the bio covers is broad. Within the biosphere, we're all debating what's the right thing to do, what we should protect, what we should prohibit, what we should require, and so on. We all agree that that's what the ethics bit of it is about, doing the right thing. But we have very different views about the criteria or the substance of doing the right thing and how these criteria might be applied to particular puzzles that present themselves in the biosphere. And some years ago, I suggested that there were formally anyway, three dominant views that in response to the question, well, what's the right thing to do? One would be the rights view, a view particularly about human rights, where the right thing to do would always be to act in ways that would respect the rights of others, respect rights or respect human rights. Now, within each of these three approaches, there are many different sort of sub-approaches, but formally, if you say, well, what's the right thing to do? It's about respecting rights. And then a second view, a more traditional view, would be well, the right thing to do is to act in accordance with our duties. So a duty-based view rather than a rights-focused view. And the duties could be to oneself or to others. But again, a whole coalition or collection of duty-based views. So some of them religious views, some of them secular. But secular views, Kantianism and communitarianism are species of duty-based views, but they're quite different. Again, a collection of views there that say the right thing to do is to act in accordance with one's duty. And then the third view formally is that the right thing to do is to try and do some good or to avoid harm. And I suppose utilitarianism and variants on utilitarian thinking are the easiest example of this kind of approach. And so, my view was that these were the three dominant voices within bioethics and biolaw. In some cases, you would find all three views expressed, and there would be a three-way contestation, principally. Often you'd find the utilitarians and the rights theorists would have enough common ground to dominate the more conservative duty views. Sometimes it wouldn't work like that. Other times, there would just be a two-sided contestation. Often utilitarians and rights theorists would be at odds with one another, or utilitarians and duty theorists. Or, so there are many possible permutations. But if you say and those would then be picked up within the biolaw debates too. So if you would say, well, what is the pattern of contestation within biolaw and bioethics? I for myself, I don't say everybody has to read it in the same way. This would be the basic framework of contestation around rights and duties and doing good or avoiding harm. Now, within each of these approaches, key concepts like consent, for example, or autonomy or dignity are given very different interpretations. In the case of consent, for example, I don't think utilitarians are particularly fussed about consent. It's a transaction cost for them. It might be a necessary cost, but it's a transaction cost. Whereas for rights theorists, consent is the key dynamic. If you want to negotiate and change, get a bit of movement into rights positions, then it's through the dynamic of consent that we do this, that we can individually negotiate our rights. We can waive the benefits of the rights that otherwise protect us. And we are then precluded from complaining about acts by those who are authorized to act in this way that would otherwise be treated as infringements of our rights. The consent is the defense for them. In a more conservative duty camps where consent is recognized as well, but in the conservative schools thinking, the consent is extremely limited, and particularly where we're talking about the duty not to compromise human dignity, then famously, even if you have the consent of other parties, that's not enough to give you an answer to the accusation that you're compromising human dignity. You can't negotiate it in the way that it works within the rights school. So we have these, this is the pattern of it. And in relation to pandemic, it seems to me that biolawyers and bioethicists would say, we now, although the ingredients are the same here, rights, duties, and doing good, avoiding harm, the balance of play, rather like in a chess match, has changed. I mean, it's a bit like you might say in normal circumstances, in a chess game, the player who plays white has a bit of an advantage, or you might not see it strategically that way, but let's suppose that is the ordinary understanding. If you play first, white has a slight advantage. But in extraordinary circumstances, it might be that things turn around. Black has the advantage in extraordinary circumstances for some reason, or vice versa, depending on how you read it. Well, what I would say was that given that political and moral philosophy was so sweet in relation to rights theory in the 1970s, when modern bioethics was really beginning its life, it's not surprising that rights view should be so prominent within bioethical and biolegal thinking, and again reinforced by the post-war agreements on human rights and the whole stream of human rights thinking that inform the way North America and Europe we identify ourselves. So it's not surprising that rights should be such a prominent voice, and against utilitarian or paternalistic views, against duty, rather conservative duty views that want to narrow down the choices being made available, particularly in areas like reproduction. That would be what we normally would expect to find in ordinary times. But what happens with the pandemic and in states of exceptional or extraordinary circumstances is that, at least at the height of it, rights, the voice of rights virtually drops off the radar. This is the change that takes place. You don't hear people pleading their rights, or at least if they do, they don't get a very sympathetic hearing, because the pattern now is dominated by a mixture of utilitarian, for the general good or avoidance of harm, minimizing the harm that the pandemic can do, or by, very much so, by duty-based, I think, theories, duty-based ethics, which emphasize the importance of solidarity, and which solidarity and responsibility. So I saw that Ellen's just flashed up that in the United States, rights is still a strong voice. And I'm saying it drops off the radar, but don't let me try to avoid a misunderstanding here. As we begin to ease the restrictions, at least there have been restrictions, where there have been very strong restrictions on rights, rights of freedom of movement and freedom of association. When we begin to ease those restrictions, or don't ease them as quickly as people think they should be eased, then the rights view comes back very, very strongly indeed. We have constant reminders that these exceptional restrictions, for the sake of dealing with a pandemic, should not be perpetuated any longer than necessary. I don't know, Ellen, whether that's I don't hear in the UK anyway, or in Europe, the rights voice, sort of strident rights, that, oh, well, you know, it's my choice whether I do this, that, or the other. But we do have that when people are being asked to download apps for their devices, which will enable them to be traced and tracked very easily. You know, we immediately hear about privacy and rights there. But generally, at the height of the pandemic, I think that the people who are arguing solidarity, duty, responsibility, and so on, really had the upper hand in these debates. And, you know, maybe we should celebrate a rare victory for this, for this particular school of thinking. But I mean, only recently, just the other day this week in the UK, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson was saying that parents who are reluctant to send their children back to school in a week's time or so, because they weren't yet confident that the children would be safe, they had a duty. Boris said they had a duty to, a duty to send their kids back. And again, I'm down on the south coast of England, and we're just across from the Isle of Wight, a little island that just lies off the south coast of England, which was where they were going to pilot the app that would be supposedly this world-beating test and trace app, which never eventuated. But on the island, they were protesting there that there were privacy issues, and they weren't altogether happy about it. But the health minister, Matt Hancock, thought it was sufficient to say in response, well, you have a duty. You have a duty in these. Yeah. So I'm saying that oh, sorry, if you can hear a phone in the background. Sorry, I can't just stop that one. But the first story is that we have resources within biolaw and bioethics about rights and duties and utility. Rather like a kaleidoscope, in different contexts, you get a different pattern, and the pandemic gives you a different pattern again. But you know, the ingredients there, the crystals or whatever it is, they are the same ones. It's just that duty and utility for the moment have become the predominant voices. Rights has been suppressed. I don't mean it's been knocked out altogether. It's going to reassert itself fairly rapidly, and we're, you know, So that's, and I think that's a plausible. I mean, it might be different from one country to another, but I think that that kind of account has some plausibility. I'm not saying that's not plausible, but I don't think it's the better version of what's going on, because the better version requires us to step outside this paradigm and think in a different way. And in the time that remains, I want to try to give some indication of what this different way is. And I'm not sure how in a short time best to say this, but the different view is that there are 3 levels of contestation, if I can put it this way, or 3 levels of considerations that we need always to have in mind. And we're pretty good at bearing 2 levels of consideration in mind, but this third one is the one we constantly miss, and that whether you view this prudentially or morally, this is fatal. So the first level is what I call a negotiation of a social license. Okay, just a social license. So this is particular to each community, each society, each group. The question is, shall we? Well, I mean, for example, shall we use test and trace apps or whatever it might be we're talking? We could be talking about anything that we're going to contend, where there are a plurality of views. Within the group, within the society, there will be people who are for it, people who are against it, people who are not decided either way. And their reasons for being for it or against it might be ethical, might be purely self-interest, but there is a plurality of views. And in a sort of tradition of deliberative democracy, we think that decent society or regulators and lawmakers within their society should consult widely, get hold of the range of views, and then try to come up with some sort of accommodation of all this, which is at least not unacceptable. It's not to say it's the only possible accommodation, but they will try and accommodate in a reasonable sort of way. Erick was going to run a conference in Gran Canaria this summer, and I was going to give a paper there, which was a response to Sarah Franklin's paper. I don't know whether you know this, in which she talks about the bewilderment of modern bioethics, saying that modern bioethics seems now to just signed up to process as being the thing that really matters, like deliberative democracy. and a kind of an unclear balancing exercise goes on where you come out at the end of it with some sort of position that's not, at least not unreasonable. And I was going to say, yeah, well, there is a lot of that goes on, I do think, and we need to go beyond that, because that isn't my idea of what bioethics should be constituted. But this is a first level where we have people with legitimate, what we recognize to be legitimate interests, but they are competing and conflicting interests. We have to try to arrive at some accommodation which people can live with. You know, okay. Now, in some societies, like, and the United States is the clearest example of this, but in Europe too, we commit to and privilege a level of interest which, in both these places we recognize as fundamental rights. And characteristically, in a Dworkinian way, we understand that where rights are engaged over and above mere interests or inclinations or self-interest, then those rights take priority. Of course, there can be conflicts at that level too, but we understand that there is this relationship of rights trumping or acting as side constraints on these first level judgments we make. So there's a second layer of judgment. And I think, where this prevails, we're pretty good at this too. We have some very sophisticated jurisprudence about the relationship between rights and mere interests, and between one kind of right and another kind of right. And, in both the European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence and in the US, massively, of course, in the Supreme Court's jurisprudence there. So I am probably in the constitutional jurisprudence of most legal systems. There's a really rich literature on these higher values and how they relate to sort of more routine values. But this is all particular to particular communities, and although I think we're pretty good at sweeping across our communities to pick up the breadth of concerns and the positives and negatives about something, I'm reasonable too at identifying the constitutive values for our particular communities, and giving priority to those values. Where I think we go wrong is with this third level, the deepest level, which is that there is a set of conditions and a set of particular kind of context, which has to be in place, both for the sake of our existence and our social life. If we are to get to first base at all as communities, and these are kind of cosmopolitan conditions or contexts, not in the sense that we happen to recognize them as such, but that they just are presupposed as the platform or the essential infrastructure or the staging for any kind of community life or individual life for that. So, and there's plenty of room to debate exactly what these conditions are, but what I'm after here are conditions or contexts which are neutral, at least in their intention, between particular humans. They're not for me or for you especially, they're for all of us. And they're not for, and they're neutral too, as between our agency, our sense of selves and our sense of the interests of others and the moral views we take. So it's not a context which is favorable to rights or duties or to utility. It's a context that is conducive to the development of a moral point of view, of recognizing that we can act on the basis that we judge we're doing the right thing, and it's it's a context that's favorable to the development of our sense of self and self-interest and being our own kind of person, that kind of, without being slanted towards a particular kind of view of the good life for the individual. It's entirely neutral. And as I say, some of these conditions are to do with the environment and with the conditions for existence, just for bare existence, and the others are to do with a context which is promotes agency. And it's quite possible that some of the values which we already recognize in our community's constitutive sets of fundamental values, the constitutive rights or whatever it might be, human rights or human dignity, that we recognize as identifying for our particular community, that they reach through to this fundamental set of conditions, the essential infrastructure, which I would call the global commons. The global commons is what we're talking about here. The need to maintain and protect and preserve the global commons. This is what it's about. And the pandemic is a particular example of a threat to the global commons. I mean, it's a threat. It threatens to kill us. So that's one particular, you know, anything that is a feature of life here on planet Earth, like global warming, or either if the environment becomes too hot or too cold for us to survive here. Well, in the same way, pandemics, you know, dangerous virus, infectious diseases racing around the globe. This is not the kind of staging or platform that is conducive to human existence, but it's also not conducive to human agency either, because no matter what our interests are, no matter what for ourselves we want, or what we think is the right thing to do, no matter what, these restrictions on our movement and association are impediments to, you know, in a neutral way, they're impediments, I think, to our agency. The point is that they are increasingly prevalent, these threats to the global commons. Particularly, I think, because of the development of new technologies, we are finding new ways of compromising the global commons. And when we try to work out what's wrong or what's objectionable about some practices that we suspect are not in our interests, actually, then we have difficulty in just putting our finger on it. So, for example, often people will think that privacy or dignity is the deep reason why we should be objecting to these things, but they find it hard to get beyond the community constitutive values, the fundamental values of their community. And often, in fact, they're fighting a rearguard battle with opponents who want to downgrade privacy and dignity to mere interests, which have to be put into this general sort of first level kind of, or whatever level, ordinary level balancing, let alone recognizing privacy and dignity as values that go right back as components of the global commons itself, which are the most important values for us to be protecting. Although this isn't sort of on the agenda, it's not pandemics, but Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism is a good example of someone drawing attention to data collection and data processing practices by big tech companies, which in Zuboff's view is part of an agenda to actually control, not just to anticipate the choices we make as agents, but actually to control those choices in a highly dystopian way. But what will be dystopian about it is that this would be compromised in the context for our agency. It's not going to kill us, but it would compromise, I think, in a very serious way, the conditions for our agency if the choices that we are making are no longer our own choices. And so autonomy, in that sense, does reach right back through to those global commons conditions. And so one way of sort of interpreting what I'm saying, I suppose, is that if you're interested in autonomy and dignity in the context of a pandemic, the most interesting place to try to see where autonomy and dignity are part of this picture are back at the global commons level. This is the unexamined, unexplored part of, I think, the framework. And I mean, it's arguable too that these conditions that are the basic platform for human social existence do go beyond bioethics and go beyond prudential or moral reason. That if you were to say, well, are the reasons for respecting the environment or the conditions and context for agency, are these prudential or are they moral or ethical? And the answer would be, well, both. Both, but actually more than both, if I can put it that way. We can't actually do prudential reason or moral reason or ethics unless these conditions are in place. We can't have the kind, it's true, we couldn't have this webinar without the advantages of modern IT. It's part of an essential infrastructure for conducting this webinar. But we were able to survive and to exercise our agency before before the internet and IT of this kind was developed. So although it's enhanced, it's an enhancement to the infrastructure. I think the essential, in the purest way, the essential infrastructure is a bit deeper than that even. But this is clearly a critical part of modern infrastructure, such as they are. But we need to keep our eye on what goes even deeper than that. And the reasons for protecting that are reasons that we, well, are reasons that, yeah, say, go beyond prudence and go beyond morality, and which we as human agents cannot. It's not just a matter, it would be unreasonable for us to say, oh, well, we can, you know, we don't need to worry too much about climate change or pandemics, you know, we don't need to worry too much about that. It would be, I mean, it would be irrational. It would, for us, where we have a set of conditions which enable us to get to first base, but without which we're either dead or compromised as agents, there is no denying that this should be our paramount concern, that these conditions are preserved at all costs. And so when people are arguing for restrictive approaches to our movement or association during pandemics, it's for the sake of these conditions that is their best argument. And those who are pleading kind of second or lower level arguments about their interests or about even the fundamental values of their community, they should be, they need to give way again, because these are lexically ordered considerations. The protection of the global commons is the #1 priority. And if it comes into conflict with any other view about the fundamental values of a particular community or my interests, preferences, well, I'm afraid that all has to give way. In the same way that the constitutive values of a particular community are lexically prior to the balancing of particular interests, but it's sort of all the way down this hierarchy. Lexical ordering applies, and the priorities are as I've just indicated. So yeah, I think that's just about as much as I want to say. Just to repeat again what I said at the beginning, I think one of the implications of taking this outside view beyond bioethics and biolaw, stepping outside the paradigm, is that we do get a chance to see the global commons as the key part of our thinking, and underexplored, underappreciated, like all infrastructures. We never appreciate them as much as we should. We don't realize just how important and valuable they are until they start getting damaged. And then we, you know, if the internet goes down, if we can't get emails, we really see just how compromising this is. The infrastructures that we kind of take for granted, they are the most important things to protect. And the infrastructure of all infrastructures, you know, global commons, is the most important infrastructure for us to keep in mind. But life being what it is, we're now in the Anthropocene and all that sort of stuff. Life being what it is, we are presenting new threats all the time to these conditions. And so we need to be particularly alert to this all the time. And I'm saying that it's not a question of returning to normal, albeit a slightly different normal. It's the lesson we should take from this is that all the time we need to be vigilant about the protection of the global commons. We all individually have a responsibility for this, but of course internationally we expect a coordination of that responsibility. And again, it's particularly worrying, obviously, that the WHO, which looks like the obvious candidate doing the international coordination, is being undermined by strong global players who don't now see it as their interest to support the WHO. We all have, I mean, you might be critical of the WHO, but we all have the same interest in the maintenance of the global. That's it, I think.
Okay, Roger, thank you very much for your talk. Certainly it's been really, really, really interesting. So a great talk, I think. So we have some questions here. Let me pick a couple of them. So, okay, regarding your vision beyond bioethics, beyond biolaw to deal with the global issues, and being yourself one of the pioneers of biolaw in the world in Europe, and regarding what is the right thing to do in these pandemic times, if you had to choose one, so which one do you think is more workable or usable to deal with these global issues in these times? A bioethical model or a biolaw model? Can you see any difference between them?
Well, yes. Well, I see a difference between the two accounts I've given you, but let's just start with bioethics versus biolaw. The way, and here I have to, Eric, I'm afraid, just say something briefly about Law 3.0. Law in its original incarnation, Law 1.0, in the common law world, which is the empire of courts and the empire of litigation and disputes. In that world, questions of the effectiveness of law and the legitimacy of law don't really bulk very large. The main concerns there are about doctrinal coherence. So it's very inward looking. You know, lawyers working over the cases are constantly thinking, does this, what's going on here, fit with what's going on here? Is there some sort of contradiction or tension? Can we make this more coherent, clean it up? You know, we want doctrine to have kind of integrity. We value that for its own sake, and that's what we're about. Now, that view of the world, or that view of what law is about, breaks down, I think, in the 19th century with, you know, the earlier years of industrialization. We start abandoning in contracts and torts and criminal law key ideas that are part of the common law jurisprudence, like in criminal law. We recognize all sorts of absolute or strict liability offenses, regulatory offenses. And I think in the UK now, probably 95% of the criminal law is of that kind. Mens rea has dropped out of the picture. In torts, we become less concerned about fault. And again, stricter liability is introduced. And in contracts, we give up on the idea that people have to really agree about anything. It's reasonable notice is good enough. Now, this is a sign of a more regulatory mindset taking shape. The question now is not about keeping law principled and coherent. The question now is about what are we actually trying to do? And the regulatory mode of thinking is very policy focused. You know, this is the policy, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to knock out this pandemic, shall we say. And so everything now has to be focused on doing that. But it prioritizes, or there's a danger of prioritizing, effective delivery of the policy. It's very sort of rationally instrumental. You know, instrumental rationality, means to ends. Law now becomes, you know, we agonize about whether law can be more efficient or more effective, more economical, but it's mainly about what works. What works. And the danger here is that questions about the legitimacy and acceptability of law drop into the background. And so if you're just contrasting biolaw with bioethics, and I would say to the extent that biolaw is about what works and, you know, getting effective interventions, then it needs to be, I mean, we need to certainly complement that or constrain it by a discourse which is about, not about so much about works, but what about the right thing to do. So I do think that bioethics is hugely important. And I mean, if you have to choose between the two, bioethics, I'd rather have legitimate regulation that might not work too well than effective regulation that we don't think is legitimate, or that's not, you know. And I mean, the way things are going generally in health and bio law, with the automation of processes, the use of you know, artificial intelligence, machine learning to make judgments that like, you know, triaging judgments about which patients to prioritize for beds in the intensive care unit, where humans are no longer really part of the loop. If you're going in that direction, it might be more effective. You might make, you know, like insurance companies or credit companies trying to assess the risk of the people they deal with. They might make, from their business point of view, better judgments. And we might allocate healthcare resources more effectively if we relied on smart machines to make the decisions. But with humans out of the loop, would that be legitimate? You know, that's the question. And again, I mean, if you think the story, when we talk about the need for things to be human-centric in their operation, it's not a question so much of whether they kill us, I think. You know, the robots killing us, it's whether the robots crowd out our opportunities for agency in ways that the global commons are supposed to support. So I think taking your question in that particular way, I'd say we have to always choose the bioethics as being the prior consideration. But when we get to look at the components of the global commons, just like the components of a constitution where you have rights in competition with one another, you can find that the conditions for human existence are in competition with the conditions for human agency. Because the restrictions we impose for the sake of keeping us alive might not be compatible with or conducive to our agency. Well, they're not. And we have to make a choice there. And it seems to me that actually without existence, there is nothing. So if agency has to be compromised, the conditions for agency do have to be compromised there, then yeah, okay, I think, but going back to what I was saying when Ellen was raising that question, it needs to be very carefully monitored. It needs to be no more than absolutely necessary, in the way that we would view, yeah, infringements on privacy or whatever within a rights framework. Okay, we can accept that there are some arguments, some considerations that justify a restriction of privacy, but it must be no more than necessary. It must be proportionate, that sort of thing. So, but again, I think we're in uncharted waters in trying to get our heads around what exactly is in what I'm calling the global commons. What exactly are these conditions, and how do they relate to one another? Where we have horizontal conflicts at that level, how do we arbitrate them? What really takes priority there? I mean, because the scheme I put in front of you has vertically establishes where the priorities are. But once we get horizontal at any of those levels, then we have problems about which bits of it to prioritize, which bits to privilege.
Okay, I think the audience is satisfied with your answer, Roger. So we have another one over here from the audience. So it says, just to clarify one of your points, yes. you have written along with Erick Biolaw on dignity.
Yeah.
So yes. Do you think it's the most important principle to be considered in these times? So if so, could you justify that?
Yeah, well, I've, yeah, of course, the book that Erick and I wrote is now nearly 20 years ago. What happened at the time that we wrote the book, we both had an interest, of course, in biotech, and although as a contract lawyer, I did have some interest in the development of e-commerce and the internet. At that stage, I hadn't developed an interest in law, regulation, and technology as a whole. I hadn't sort of picked up that what I was really going to be interested in was the whole field of technology, emerging technologies, and so as the years have gone by, I've tried to find a place for human dignity in my scheme of thinking that doesn't just end up saying that at the kind of the second level, if I put it, below the global commons, but for each community will have its own distinctive take on human dignity. In liberal-minded communities, human dignity will be, encourage not just people making their own choices, but having, unless people can give very good reasons, the widest possible range of choices. Whereas in other communities, there'll be a more conservative view on this. And although they might say, yes, it's important that people do make their own choices where they make them, we're not so keen on the idea of having all these choices available. We're going to be more restrictive about the choice. The choices that we think is legitimate for you to make are more restricted. Although we agree with you that when you do make choices, they should be your own choices. And of course, many of the big jurisprudential cases on human dignity are illustrations of that tension between those two views. I wanted to try and go beyond that, Erick, and so looking for, I mean, if human dignity and dignity has a place within the global commons, it's on the agency wing of things. It's not to do with our existence. You know, if our agency is compromised, like say in George Orwell's book Big Brother, or you know, like I'm saying in Shostakovich Zuboff's view of what's going on with surveillance society, if our dignity is compromised, I think it's on the agency wing. You could say that it's to do with the compromising of self-development, but dignity seems to me more about the way we relate to others. And so I want to say that the way in which human dignity belongs here is to do with the context for moral development, that it doesn't favor any particular moral view, but it says that the context must be conducive to people making their own moral judgments. In other words, they must be, and then being able to act freely on those judgments. So in the writing on technology, I've been critical of technologies that do too much work for us. I mean, if we get to relying on personal devices like Alexa or whatever it might be, to give us moral advice, and their advice generally is pretty reliable, shall we say, but we rely on our smart devices to give us moral advice, then what we do morally is no longer our own judgment. And if we are constrained by architecture or other technological features to act in a particular way, then we don't freely choose to do the right thing, even if we think that what we're doing is the right thing. I think I can give an account of what human dignity might mean within the global commons. But if you're saying what's the most urgent thing for us to do, well, I would say, I mean, the biggest threat is to human life itself, to our existence. And, you know, we've had shocking stories about people being put into situations where we must have known that, yeah. So, I mean, if it were being proposed, for example, that we should make more use of robots and automated, you know, I mean, maybe we should build special places for patients who have test positive, but instead of having humans in there in the front line, exposing themselves to the risk of infection, insofar as you could replace humans with robots or with automated, yeah, where there's no risk of infection, and they don't get tired and they work 24/7. Then I'd say that, well, yeah, that's a good bet. People say, but look, that means patients don't then get the benefit of the human touch. You know, if they're not interacting with humans in intensive care units or these hospitals, you know, you remove something that they really value, and that's true. But if the robots keep them alive as well and reduce the level of infection, I think, you know, that would be a fair trade to make. But we're talking here about difficult judgments, and it's not just a question of the breadth of views on this. It is, as I say, trying to understand the depth of these concerns and arguments. Are they going right back to the global commons or to our community distinctive values, or is it just a matter of, you know, balancing the preferences we happen to have? That sort of thing. I mean, sorry, it's not as clear as I would like to make it, but I hope you get the gist of that.
I think it's clear enough. So we have the last one right here is from the audience as well.
Yeah.
You know, it's from Natalia Pedraza. Let me translate it, please.
Oh, thanks.
So because it's in Spanish originally. So thank you very much for the presentation. It was excellent. So do you agree with under the idea of protecting public health and life? So states can impose control policies that violate some fundamental rights of population?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Natalia, for that question. So if what this turns out to be is that the state is imposing restrictions which are intended to protect the global commons, you know, they have the highest possible, they're responding to that, but the restrictions would normally be treated as infringements of the fundamental values of that particular community and perhaps many other communities. Then this would be kind of first order value coming into competition with a second order value. and the global commons values being the first order, the highest values, and the fundamental values of that particular community would be second order, but they'd have to give way. So while you would recognize that there is, something to regret here, because you are infringing values which distinctively for your community are fundamental, but this is the lesser of two evils in the circumstances. You have to give way to the prior concerns about protecting the global commons. Yeah, it means, I think that's exactly it. If on the other hand you don't think that the state's protective measures are designed to protect the global commons, but are for other reasons altogether, political reasons, then for sure the fundamental values of that community would take priority. But there would be an interpretive job to do here on understanding precisely what the thinking was behind these restrictions and the nature of the restrictions too.
Okay. Thank you very much, Roger. So it's time to move on to our next speaker, but thank you very much for having participated with us. Great talk, very useful, very helpful, I think. You can keep connected with us if you want.
I will stay, if I may, Eric, I'm going to stay connected through some part of, it's the afternoon here, but in an hour or so, I'm going to have to move on.
Okay, thank you very much for everything.
Thanks very much, everyone.
It's been a pleasure to share with you. Thank you very much. Ok, algunas instrucciones antes de nuestro siguiente speaker. So don't forget that the speaker will give the talk followed by a question and answer time. Every speaker has 30 minutes to talk, followed by 15 minutes of question and answer. You'll be able to ask questions, but you have to write them down while the speaker is talking. To do it, please look at the bottom of the screen and click on the word YouTube. You'll be taken right away into a YouTube channel where you can watch the event and write your question like on a chat. I have to warn you that if you remain on the university platform, you'll watch the seminar without any problem, but you won't be able to ask. So if you want to ask, please go into the YouTube channel right now. So we have to please accept our apologies in advance because we have to repeat these instructions every time just before every talk, as the audience can change. So no se olviden de ir al canal de YouTube para que así puedan hacer sus preguntas en el chat de la transmisión en vivo, por favor. Alberto?
Thank you, Roger, for your talk. Great talk. For me, in this moment, it's a great pleasure introduce Professor Amedeo Santosuosso. Professor Santosuosso is one of the most important Italian and European biojurists, former president of the First Chamber Court of Appeal of Milan. He is a professor of law, science, and new technology at the University of Pavia, Department of Law. He is a professor of artificial intelligence and law at Institute of Advanced Studies, Pavia, Interdepartmental Research Center, University of Pavia, and he's a scientific director of World Commission on Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology. Amedeo is, if you want to put your presentation, you have the authorization to put.
Yes. Do you hear me?
Perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you for your presentation, Juan, and also for Eric for the invitation. It's a pleasure to have this discussion with you, with my old friend Roger, and the other speakers. And okay, I'll try to share the screen and my presentation. PowerPoint should be this. Okay. So does it work? Do you see the cover? Perfect. Yep. So the title of my presentation is about the possibility, the hypothesis of measuring rights and liberties in critical decision-making scenarios. Because if we follow also the kind of discussion proposed by Roger, we see that we have a problem of understanding what is the weight of some rights and liberties in critical situations, because the weight of liberties and rights is in competition with the power of states of limiting them. So if we let to go to the next one, what perfect. Okay, if we consider, for instance, some very practical situation, the first one is the case of online criminal trials. So this is a practical problems we had in Italy during the first period of lockdown, and the proposal by the state was, okay, the judge can sit in his office and the public prosecutor can sit in his office on the other side, and the arrested person is in the police station. The lawyers reacted strongly on this, because this is a very critical point when the person, he needs even biological consistency, okay, has to be seen by the judge in order to evaluate what happened. The other case, interesting, very different, but very popular in Italy, but also in other countries, in the United States and European countries, is the case of smart working. Smart working, in some sense, is the triumph of freedom for the workers, but at the same time, it is a way of controlling them very strictly. And the third point is the lack of creativity working in distance. Okay. A critical point that can be evaluated from a bioethical point of view, in addition to the legal point of view, is the case of the possibility of relatives to visit patients. In Italy, we had plenty of old people that died without seeing their relatives. Yeah. This is something that is extremely heavy in the experience of death and the illness and so on. And then we have also the case of quarantine. Quarantine is a clear deprivation, radical deprivation of freedom of movement. And there is a discussion in the constitutional doctrine in Italy about the necessity of guaranteeing the possibility of a reaction to the quarantine, in the sense that to go before the court in order to claim for the liberty. This is just a very little list of problems. So now I am going to present something that is a research in progress we have at the University of Pavia. So I have to ask not to use the content of this presentation without authorization. It's something that normally in cases like this happens. So the problem we have with the pandemic is that we have, in many cases, a situation of emergency, and we have public and private actors that have to make decisions very quickly, because sometimes we had in Italy, for instance, some critical situation because of the delay of the decision. Okay, so the need for a quick decision is important, and also these kind of decisions have to take into account a multitude of factors. So the factors that has to be considered in some cases can be expressed in very easily in quantitative terms. In other cases, we have to consider situations that are more complex because they involve qualitative aspects and terms. And this is, you do not have to read this, this page because it is written in Italian, but this is the list of special powers that the Prime Minister in Italy was given at the end of February as the power of one person, not the government, the power of simply the Prime Minister to limit very important liberties. Just to make some examples. One of basic freedom is the freedom of movement. In the Italian constitution, we have an article saying that all citizens may travel or sojourn freely in any part of the national territory. But in this decree of the government, it was established, it was forbidden to go out of the city or to go into another city. All travels for instruction were suspended, and there was a strict limitation of access to public transport. And in some cities like Milano, where I live, there was a prohibition to go beyond 200 meters from the house where you live. Okay, great. So very strict limitation. But also the access to justice. Okay, Article 24 of the Italian Constitution says all persons are entitled to take judicial action to protect their individual rights and legitimate interests. The right of defense is inviolable at every stage and level of the proceeding. But we had public offices that were closed. So, and even the tribunals and the courts. And if we go on in this list of, okay, another right in the Italian constitution is the right to education. Schools are open to everyone. Primary education is compulsory and free. But we had all the schools were closed, from primary schools to the university. Okay, and only after some weeks we started with some teaching remotely. Okay, freedom of religion and freedom of association, they were completely suspended. Any kind of manifestation and cultural initiative, religious initiative was suspended by decision of the authority. So the problem is, when we have to take a decision, like in the pandemic, for instance, normally we consider civil rights and liberties as something that can be important, but that cannot be put in comparison with economic necessity, employment necessity, social and health-related effects. Why? Because if you have to take a decision with an economic implication, you have the possibility to calculate the amount of the goods, produced, of services produced, or for the employment, the number of employees, of people who has lost their work. From the social point of view, how many students can reach the school, and so on. And also the health-related effects can be measured in some sense, because the number of people that are in the emergency units and so on. But civil rights and liberties are essential in any kind of decision in a situation like the pandemic. And the participation of civil rights and liberties in the evaluation of what is best in the situation, it would be necessary in order to have a decision that is correct and that takes into account all the interests involved. So we have some criteria given by the legal doctrine and the course and the experience. So we know that even fundamental rights can be limited in special situations. Even the fundamental rights written in our constitutions and Bill of Rights very often are in a balance with other fundamental rights. And very often we do not know in advance who will prevail. among these different fundamental rights. So the idea of limiting fundamental rights is not a strange idea, but one first and principal criterion we have to adopt in public decision is that the limitation should be proportionate to the need, the situation that has to be faced. And the other important point is the limitation in time of the limitation of rights, to time limitation. Because even something that is right in itself or may be considered as a sacrifice that cannot be avoided, but if it lasts too much, it is not justified anymore. So the problem is that, okay, we have some experience in the legal doctrine, some experience in order to evaluate the effects of specific provisions that are introduced by regulations and reforms and so on. A very easy case to be understood is the case if you want to make more appealing your economic system, you can introduce some facilitations for the companies and investors that want to come in your country. And so you can measure in some sense what is the result of this legal decision, of this sometimes is also an act of parliament doing this. But the problem is when we go in the field of fundamental rights, civil rights, liberties, the problem is more complicated. So at the moment, we do not have an ability to develop a quantitative analysis able to identify the impact of the compression of fundamental rights and freedoms. But this is not, in my view, a problem in itself. Because we might say, okay, fundamental rights, civil liberties are very strange objects in the human landscape, and we do not need to quantify them, to measure them. But the problem is that giving them this very high and noble level in our societies, we put them out of any kind of balance with other measures that are taken in the pandemic, for instance, okay? And so our ambition in our research is to give a weight to the rights and liberties in order to give the possibility to the legislator or any kind of public authority to put them in the comparison and in the evaluation of what is the sacrifice of this liberty in comparison with the needs of public health. Our research has two phases. The first one is an ex post review of the legislation put in place, and the second part of our research is to develop a model for forecasting the better decision for the future. In order to realize this, we have to give rights and freedoms a parameter. So we have to transform their content in something that can be measured. And in order to do this, we can consider different aspects. One is, for instance, the entity of the limitation. Because one thing is if the emergency legislation says you do not have to go beyond 200 meters from your house. Another thing is if you do not have to go out of your city. Another thing, if you cannot go out of your region or out of the state. Of course, these are all levels that can be quantified and also measured. Okay. The other aspect is time, combining the intensity of the deprivation of the liberty with the time of this deprivation, we have a quantified value. And doing this, we have the possibility to say, okay, we want to, I have to clarify that our point of view, none of us is a negationist, okay, of the pandemic. We recognize the need of a balance. We want to make this balance possible for the future. And if you consider, for instance, we have a very recent scandal in Italy of people that in Sardinia violated the rules given by the central government and partially also from the region. And they claimed for their liberty, okay, but it is not our case. We do not want to put liberty against the social need to control the pandemic. We want just to make the comparison possible. And so the methodology that used in the past in comparative studies, and the rights we want to firstly analyze are access to justice, because access to justice is one of the crucial points in an emergency situation, because you can have emergency powers, but the possibility to have access to justice is something that makes the difference from the dictatorship and a democratic system in a critical situation. Right to education, the access to schools and university and so on, freedom of movement, and also freedom of speech, including in the freedom of speech also the liberty of cult, religions, and so on. So the entity and the duration. And let's go back to and this is my last point, to the practical example. And let's consider the case of quarantine. Okay, we have quarantine measures in Italy. And in the constitutional doctrine, there is a divide. On one side, we have traditional constitutional lawyers saying that, okay, the quarantine is something that is, of course, a limitation of liberty of movement, but it has a very special justification. And we cannot use the concept of personal freedom when it is a matter of quarantine. This is the traditional view. On the other side, we have the view of more open to European legislation, also of Italian scholars, remembering that the Article 5 of the European Convention of Human Rights says that everyone has the right to liberty and security of person. No one shall be deprived of his liberty, save in the following cases. And one case is the lawful detention of persons for the prevention of the spreading of infectious disease. So this is a demonstration that personal freedom can be limited for health reasons. But the same Article 5 gives the possibility to everybody for any kind of arrest of detention to take proceedings by which the lawfulness of his detention shall be decided speedily by a court. And I think that this is a very sensitive point. We have to develop a very practical point of view, because we cannot deny, of course, Roger said, okay, the first point is to survive, to be alive. Otherwise, also speaking of rights does not make too much sense. But on the other side, we have to, in our view, we have to preserve the ability of our societies to be resilient on, even from the point of view of the legal system. So we have an emergency, we need some limitations, but these limitations should be open to the reaction of people and to the public discussion in order to the need of these limitations. So this is the end of my speech, and I thank you for the attention and for giving me the possibility to participate in this very interesting webinar. Thank you. I apologize for the name on my label. Maria Laura Fiorina is the name of an assistant of mine, and I tried several times to change, but every time again reappears Maria Laura. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Amedeo, for your great talk. It's very provocative in sense of this kind of model of a quantitative model of the impact of the law in this situation. And you have a first question about the when you have to balance the civil rights and with economic right and public health. One of the conditions is the limitation of time, no? But what happens when a state of emergency is maintained for a long time? What is tools do you have to evaluate the impact of law a priori, ex ante? Because this is the big problem was when in the world the situation of emergency is very long and then it's very challenge.
Oh yeah, this is a very good point and very important. We know that according to some political doctrine, the emergency powers are the foundation of power. Okay, the man or the institution who has the power of saying we are in emergency, okay, they have the power. But luckily in countries like European countries and like Italy, specifically, we have a constitutional court. And during the first period of lockdown, we had a very important declaration of the president of the constitutional court saying explicitly that some limitations of rights can be accepted, but it's a matter of time. So the time has not to be too long. So the first period of emergency declared in Italy lasted till the end of July. At the end of July, the Prime Minister, he was very happy of his powers. And so he said, okay, we can go on till the end of the year. Wow, at the moment it was a good Italy, that was the worst European countries at the beginning. At the end of July was perhaps one of the best. Okay, but he said, no, we have to go on till the December. So there was a strong political reaction. At the end of the story, there was a prorogation of the emergency powers, but till the mid-October. So this is something, of course, everything is questionable in this matter, but it is also an example of good functioning of the political discussion. So the man who had the major power tried to had this power till the end of the year, but the political reaction, the institutional reaction was very strong. And so we had a limitation in a couple of months. I can't hear you. Okay.
Micrófono, Alberto. Sí.
Do you have any question?
Yes. Yes. There are a couple of more questions here, Amedeo, from the audience for you.
Yes.
There's one from, it says, for example, so if I understand well, are you trying to say that liberty is more important than life?
Okay, but this is a full circle because, of course, life is the basis of liberty, but life without liberty is something like a worm. Also, a worm is living, but he has no rights unless we decide to say, okay, we want to establish and recognize the rights of worms. On this, we have to be very, very clear.
Okay, and we have one more here. Regarding one of your main points, do you think the measures taken by Italian government compared to Sweden, for example, and other European countries have been proportionate?
In the first period, they were proportionate. And Italy is a matter of national culture. When we are in a strict emergency in Italy, we are able to perform unexpected results and sacrifices and so on. When we have to plan our future, we are not so good. So in phase 2, changing from the moment, okay, we have to stay home because this is a strict necessity, we had an unexpected level of compliance with the orders, okay? Very, very high. And this is the reason why in two months and a half, we had excellent result in the decreasing of the infections and so on. But now that we have to make the plans for the recovery fund, for instance, we have to decide what is more important for our country, for our future. It's a drama. It's a drama more than we have. Europe offering funds, money, opportunities not for Europe, but for Italy. We can do nice things for our country. And now we are in a little bit of confusion. So I am confident that we'll do something good. But I think that Sweden was not a very good model. And it's a matter of, how to say, effectiveness of the result. And the result, having a look at the figures, is not so good in Sweden. It's not so good. And we cannot say this is, perhaps there is a cultural difference between the two countries. We are reluctant in Italy in saying, okay, your sacrifice is good for the society, okay? Because the person sacrificed can object, okay, because of his, her personal rights. But I think that the first reaction in the first month in Italy was good. Now we have to change our mind. We are doing some efforts, and I hope we'll do well.
Okay. I don't know if Roger or Anders have some comments to share. Yes, Roger?
Yeah, it's great to see Amedeo again. And yeah, I just wondered, Amedeo, whether you've come across Alain Supio's book, Governance by Numbers. It was only recently translated into English. So I think it's been in French for a few years, but I must say I was very taken by his book. And as you gather from the title, Governance by Numbers, he's not very happy where we try to quantify those things that we particularly value in the law. In fact, he sees the movement from law and rule of law and legality and rules, that sort of idea, to governance as a very slippery kind of thing indeed. But my take on this would be that where you try to quantify or measure things, it's not always bad, no, but far from it. But as soon as you start doing that, I'm worried about the economists and the utilitarians taking over, okay? And that we end up with a kind of, I was saying about flattening our ethics so that everything's on the same plane and not recognizing the kind of topography, of the depth as well as the breadth of our ethics. And so to the extent that the measuring or quantifying of the constraints is to make a better judgment about proportionality of the restriction, then I think, well, that must be smart. But I just wonder whether you sense that you might be opening the back door to some unwelcome visitors from the.
So it's clear that the problem is that very often we do not have a real comparison in order to evaluate the proportionality. Saying that all rights and liberties are so noble things, and so we are out of game completely. In other cases, we have some case law of the Constitutional Court and the higher courts that is about the balancing of rights, okay? And they make a balance with words, okay? Developing part of reasoning that sometimes is excellent, absolutely excellent, but there is a high risk that this is something that is arbitrary. Okay?
Yeah.
And
I mean,
so Roger, I don't think that is possible, a full parameterization of rights and liberties. It's crazy to think so. But I want to have a chance to have rights and liberties in the game of the economic measures, social measures, and so on. It is a challenge. I don't know. I'll keep you posted about the research, and we can see again with a new round of this discussion.
We have one more question here is from Laura Victoria Puentes. Let me translate it because it's in Spanish. So you have talked in your presentation about the consequences from rights and liberty from a kind of constitutional perspective, and also you have talked about the situation at courts. But do you consider that a study from a biolaw perspective could offer a different solution for problems regarding limitation of rights?
Oh, in some sense, I consider my proposal, that is not simply my proposal, is a group of people working on this, but of course I take my responsibility. In some sense is an example of biolaw study. Why not? Why not? I can get the point why this kind of legal approach, constitutional approach, should be seen as in opposition with the biolaw approach. Is one approach in the huge family of biolaw. This is my feeling, at least. I don't know if there is the idea of another biolaw approach. Okay, I am open to hear and to discuss it. But I consider biolaw as my approach. Or better, I consider my approach as within the biolaw field.
All right, Alberto.
Okay, Erick, I have a last question. Amedeo, do you think that the democracies in this emergency situation should be evaluated by quantitative index of impact of law? Is it?
I think
because
that,
it's very dangerous. Change the discussion, the public discussion, with the quantitative impact of.
No,
measure.
no, I don't think so. I think that the arguments that we can have as a result of our research could be a tool for the democratic discussion. Okay. In our view, we want to promote a democratic discussion that takes into account not only economics, not only other social aspects, and not rights and liberties. So the people who in the north of Sardinia had all the dancing bar and so on open, their claim was, oh, if we close these places, our economy is destroyed. Okay, so this is a way of giving economy an overwhelming power, too much. And so we want to have a place where everything can be on the table.
Thank you so much, Amedeo, for your excellent presentation talk and for participation in this second global seminar of the International Network of Biolaw.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Amedeo. Thank you very much. Gracias, Alberto. Okay, let's move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Anders Sandberg. Professor Sandberg is an important researcher, science debater, futurist, transhumanist, and author. He holds a PhD in computational neuroscience from Stockholm University in Sweden, and is currently a senior research fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at University of Oxford, United Kingdom. Sandberg's research is focused on societal and ethical issues surrounding human enhancement and new technology, as well as on assessing the capabilities and underlying science of future technologies. Professor Sandberg will give a talk entitled, it's very provocative, so very provocative title, so Risk Pipelines, Information Hazards, and the Freedom to Hack Life. Anders, thank you very much for having accepted our invitations. We really appreciate it. You are really, really welcome. Please go ahead with your talk.
Thank you so much. And I'm honored to be able to participate live from Sweden, the control group of Scandinavia. After all, given the implementation of the COVID response here, at least we're getting good data. We can compare Sweden to the other Scandinavian countries. That might not be the deliberate ethical choice, but at least it might be useful for the rest of the world. But over to my talk. I'm going to try to share my screen and let's see if this works. With some luck, it will. And otherwise, okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay.
Yes. So some background that might be useful here. So the Future of Humanity Institute normally deals with far future questions. We tend to think literally hundreds or thousands, or in my case, sometimes billions of years ahead. And we tend to focus on very large disasters, which would essentially be the end of humanity. So a small thing like a pandemic should not really be something we should be talking about. Except, of course, as the pandemic hit, we realized this is not the big one, but it's a good dress rehearsal. We actually need to see what can we do about this. Can we learn some important lessons? Have we learned important lessons in our research about technological threats? So I'm going to bring in some things that might, at least at the start, be relatively light on the ethics side and much more oriented towards thinking about risks, and especially risks from intentional misuse of biotechnology. I'm hoping that we can see that some of this might actually be useful for thinking about what we ought to be doing when dealing with a pandemic like COVID. So the first issue is, of course, who is likely to cause intentional human-caused biorisks? So a cliche, of course, might be something like biohackers sitting in their kitchen brewing up something horrible. A more plausible risk, at least in terms of having actually happened, is, of course, apocalyptic cults that might decide that the world is going to end and we have a duty to participate in causing that ending. Now, in fact, quite a lot of apocalyptic and doomsday cults don't have this view. You actually need to have a very peculiar theology to end up with this particular position. But it certainly happened in the Aum Shinrikyo case in Japan. And another one of the big bioterrorism outbreaks was again caused by a religious group wanting to affect a local election. Another obvious risk might just be sloppy researchers. I think most of us know a little bit about offices you fear to enter, and we might fear that some researcher might be doing stupid things. And historically, when it comes to the biggest actual development of biorisk, of course, we have governments developing bioweapons. And it's possible to play around coming up with a long list of other people, both existing groups and maybe potential future groups that could want to increase biorisks. You can also, of course, imagine what groups might want to promote, for example, a pandemic, even though they didn't cause the pandemic, they might have various forms of interest in furthering it. So a while ago, when discussing this, we realized that there is a kind of risk pipeline. When you get to a biodisaster, you need to go through a number of steps. So at first, you need somebody with a bad intention or a bad insight that leads to ideas for making a sequence if they're generating a new organism. And then turning that sequence from code in a computer into actual DNA, adding that to a biosystem so you can actually culture it enough to get something they can test, find a way of dispersing it, and then dispersing it such a way that consequences ensue. Now, the interesting thing about this pipeline, which I'm going to use as a kind of recurrent metaphor throughout this talk, so I hope you can forgive me for a lot of pictures of pipes, is that each of these steps might be a hard step. They might be observable. For example, Shinrikyo had several times police visits because the police suspected they were up to no good, and they had to hide or destroy the lab, and essentially had to go back to square one each time. The police didn't know what they were up to and didn't intentionally stop them, but they were fairly effective because you still need some space to have a lab. And in some cases, you need special resources. Now, it's also worth noticing that this applies even if somebody is not intentionally evil, even if they're just clumsy. We can imagine the sloppy researcher who is doing some misguided research, coming up with a somewhat risky idea, and then testing it out in the lab with bad safeguards, testing it, and then accidentally spreading it around. Now, the clumsy actor, in some sense, have extra step along the pipeline. The boss might step in, the university dean might step in and say, wait a minute, what are you actually doing? They might themselves realize that they're doing something incompetent or awful. So they have a slightly different pipeline. And of course, we might recognize that in reality, the real sequence of events is rarely a neat single pipeline. You might have branches. There might be several different groups competing, like in biotechnology, or they might share certain knowledge. We have seen that in the case of nuclear proliferation. But the key idea here is that, can we say something about who's likely to get through this pipeline and cause a bad effect in the world? So a very simple toy model might be to think of these steps as hoops you need to jump through. And the ability an actor has to actually get from one step to the next one depend on their ability. It might be skill, it might be power, it might be resources. Now, a very skillful, able, well-resourced actor is going to jump through all the steps in the risk pipeline very, very rapidly and easily. While, on the other hand, a weak actor, an actor with little skill, is going to fail relatively likely at each step. In the diagram to the right, the blue curve corresponds to the probability of getting past one single hoop, basically implementing one of the steps in the chain. And if you combine, I'm just made up the numbers, they don't necessarily correspond to any real numbers, they're just to show this general effect. But if you have several hoops, the same agent is much less likely to go through all of them, because although he or she might succeed at the first step, there is a chance that they fail at the second or third or fifth. And if there is enough steps, even though they might be able to individually handle the steps rather well, the probability of them handling all of them gets rather low. So in order to pass these thresholds of difficulty, you need to be significantly better than this difficulty. Now, there is another factor we can add to this model, and that is, of course, I forgot to mention, of course, that, okay, sorry, now I managed to confuse myself. Now, another important issue is how powerful are the groups we're thinking about? So in general, it's observed in nature that big, fierce animals are rare. Lions are much less common than cats, who are much less common than insects, and bacteria, of course, outnumber them. And in general, of course, large organizations are more rare than the small ones. And this is very relevant for thinking about organizations or groups that might cause biological risks. So in economics, for example, it's well known that the size distribution of companies tend to be log normal or power law distributed. So there are many more small companies than Walmarts and Googles. And the amount of money they have and then the amount of personnel and resources also tends to scale in the same way. If we measure national power by GDP, military budget, etc., it's also a very skewed distribution. There are very few superpowers, there is a lot of middling countries and a large number of small countries. When it comes to scientific team sizes, evidence seems to suggest that the core teams tend to have a distribution that's roughly Poisson distributed, statistically speaking. But there is this tail of enormous research collaborations like the Hugo Project or CERN. But generally, again, we have more and more done science in a collective way. We're getting larger organizations. Perhaps most relevant for thinking about bioterrorism is, of course, terrorist groups. And there seems to be some evidence suggesting that they also have a very skewed distribution, even though here, of course, it's hard to get really good data. And that seems to suggest that actually getting very large terrorist groups is very rare, but smaller ones are more common. And again, we can assume that smaller groups would tend to have fewer resources to play around with. So, regardless of who's behind a biorisk, we can probably guess with a pretty good confidence that it's more likely to be small groups that are trying to do something bad than large groups, simply because there are fewer large groups, unless there is some other factor that makes large groups or small groups particularly malicious, but I don't think we have evidence for that. Now, this produces a fairly amusing conclusion. Because of that you need to be powerful enough or skilled enough to pass through a number of steps along the risk pipeline. You can't be that kitchen bioterrorist, because kitchen bioterrorists don't have resources. There might be a lot of them, but they can't do very much. Conversely, if you look at the most powerful actors, like the United States military, if they wanted to have an enormous amount of bioweapons, they could totally set up that program. They have the skills, they have the resources, they have legal protection, but there is only one United States military. We might multiply it by different branches, but it's still relatively few actors. So if somebody causes biological risk, it seems to be mid-sized actors, basically because you multiply together the threshold effect of ability with the number of potential actors, which means that actually mid-sized groups might be the ones that provide the bulk of anthropogenic risks. And this is interesting because they tend to fly under the radar to some extent. Many tabloids and concerns about biohackers tend to say, oh, these biohackers were out of control. Nobody is governing them. They could cause a lot of damage. Yeah, potentially, except that many of them are very under-resourced. Most, even though there are many biohackers, they are not that powerful. Meanwhile, we know governments have caused tremendous damage, but there are relatively few of them. It might be that disgruntled postdocs might be much more dangerous. It might be that biotech startups cutting corners and not thinking very carefully might actually be the most risky group. Now, there is another important factor here, and that is that risk chain. I made a number of steps. You might argue that it should be longer or shorter, depending on what kind of technology we're talking about. So what happens if we imagine a risk chain that has a different length? It's also worth noticing that I assumed a similar difficulty for each step. That's not necessarily true. In fact, it turns out that if one step is harder than the others, that one is always going to dominate the dynamics. And that's going to be relevant for thinking about the legal and the ethical implications. But if we imagine a future where the risk chain gets shorter and shorter because of lab automation, because today we can do desktop genome design, I can download the code for a genome to my computer. I can have software help me upgrade it. I can order the DNA over the mail order. And increasingly, we can do the lab work, not just with a lab on our own with a robot, but I can do this mail order too. Remote lab work is getting to be a big thing. And the synthetic biology people are working very hard on making biotechnology something very shareable, something very open source, which would of course mean that malicious actors have an easier time getting access to it. So when we model it using my simple statistical model, we get the diagram to my right. So the blue curve corresponds to the previous diagram. That's the situation right now. If we imagine that the risk chain now gets shorter and shorter, that means that after a while, the really small under-researched agents, even though they're bad at causing risk, since there are many of them, they actually start having an impact. And in the extreme case where it just takes a bad intention and then you have consequences, then they are going to be totally dominant. So we see an interesting technology dependence here. The easier it is to go from bad idea to reality, the more likely it is that you get risk from numerous small groups that are going to be hard to control. However, this is mediated using technology. So we can start thinking here about where are the bottlenecks and checkpoints where we can actually do something. First of all, the probability that somebody is going to notice that somebody's up to something bad depends on how many steps they need to go through. If it's a large program, it's hard to hide. If it takes many steps, it's likely that something is going to go wrong. We have reason to actually start looking more at mid-sized actors. And we should expect that this lab automation trend is going to change effect. There is this ongoing debate in biosecurity about tacit knowledge. Many people say, don't worry, biohackers are not a problem. It's actually fairly hard to make something really dangerous in the lab. And that is going to require a lot of skills that you can't get by reading a few wiki entries, which might be true right now. But it seems that this tacit knowledge required is getting smaller. Even if it's not true, it's worth checking, actually. I think many people are overconfident in the power of tacit knowledge. And it seems that what we should look for is the hard steps. Once upon a time, it was getting access to, for example, restriction enzymes and some of the technical tools in biotechnology. But today, it might be more rare skills, that tacit knowledge, but it might also be questions about certain sequences or certain tricks. And this brings us over to the question of information hazards. And it's unlikely that the automation is going to go back in the bottle because we have good reasons to want to automate lab work more, which means that other forms of biosafety technologies might become more important in the future just to find ways of mopping up when there is going to be an ill-advised release of something. Now, thinking about pandemics and the risk pipeline, it seems that generally, if we were to get a pandemic like COVID-19, it's more likely to be due to bioerror than bioterror. Although many people have loved playing around with the idea that this is intentional, malicious release of some organism, it doesn't look very likely because most actors that work on making bioweapons, they want militarily useful pathogens. And COVID-19 is not the kind that is effective because it spreads widely. It's very hard to protect your own population and your own economy. Even if you had a vaccine, it's rather hard to discreetly vaccinate everybody you care about beforehand. China's very early vaccine, for example, turns out, since it's based on adenoviruses, that it only protects about half of the population they have tried vaccinating. And they did this without actually testing safety. So they might actually have been risking a lot of people. Now, the interesting thing here is, of course, that legitimate research, on the other hand, happens in plain sight. You might very well have an accidental release from a legitimate research lab that is actually working. And the big brouhaha a few years back about gain of function research about pandemic flu shows that this is a very real issue. But we have a real problem that the probability of a release from a lab is not zero. And if you're doing research in order to create a potentially pandemic virus, you might cause a pandemic, even though your intention was very much not to cause trouble. And some people have argued that given past bad records, for example, in the UK, they released twice the same year of foot and mouth disease from the same agricultural lab, causing significant trouble to the UK agricultural world, shows that we actually should be careful about even our normal labs. The interesting thing here seems to be that we might be able to also use this risk chain model to think about how we want to stop pandemic. Because in a sense, a pandemic is a risk chain caused by nature. And generally, it's most cost effective to fix it upstream. If you can reduce the wet markets that are likely to cause zoonoses to spread, have rapid reporting and response so you nip it in the bud early, then you can save enormous, literally trillions of dollars costs downstream. One can also, of course, add hurdles to this pipeline, which is what we're doing, using quarantine, social isolation, masks, vaccines, what have you. Now, the interesting thing is we can also speak about bad actors because we're taking actions that shorten the pandemic resistance pipeline or weaken the response mechanism. They might not be motivated so much because they wish humanity ill. They have their own purpose, like the debate about personal freedom in the United States that leads to people to refrain from taking masks because they feel it's linked to a rights issue. They're not thinking very clearly, I think, about the overall risk issue. So they're focusing on the rights issue, which means that they're probably causing a lot of harm that way. So in the block diagram I have to the right, this is from a paper I wrote some years ago about thinking about defense in depth against big disasters. It's worth noticing that many risks are caused not just by nature or a malicious humans, but by accidents or that we have systems that are intrinsically risky. There might be a latent risk that there is a fragility that can spread it, like, for example, a global communication system that allows pandemics to spread free, or we might have a commons risk where we know that there is a risk and it's all up to us to reduce it, but I'm not going to wear a mask if nobody else does because it looks weird. Here on the bus in Stockholm, I'm the only guy with mask and I'm feeling very awkward about it. And my mask is less effective as long as I'm the only one. If everybody had it, we would get a multiplicative effect. Similarly, climate change has the same commons risk. Yeah, I'm not polluting that much, and so are you. It's just that altogether, of course, we're producing too much carbon dioxide. So finding ways of handling commons risks, which of course are different for different forms of disasters, is an important way of handling the upstream thing. The malicious actors I talked about earlier are probably a relatively minor thing for pandemics. The accident risk is minor, but it also is interesting because there is a legal responsibility. The latent risk might be the most intriguing one to try to reduce. We also have issues about our current response mechanisms, which obviously are not good enough and we need to do something about it. Now, information hazards are interesting. This is where dissemination of true information cause harm or enable agents to cause harms. And biology is increasingly becoming information rather than materials. But a lot of biosecurity is focused on concerns about transporting materials. Indeed, one of the most worrisome papers I've seen in recent months was about a way of rapidly generating COVID viruses in your own lab. Basically, the whole idea was a way of generating RNA viruses that you download the code from the internet. This is great for COVID research. I also realized this is great if you happen to be a bioterrorist who really want to be able to make an RNA virus. So the question is that paper, was that worth publishing? We had the same discussion about dual use research, especially about gain of function, but also about the publishing about enhanced forms of mousepox, or for that matter, things like botulinum toxin H, which turned out to be an overhyped case. In many cases, we have both data itself that could be risky, but also idea hazards. A really good doomsday weapon scheme, don't share it with others. My director, Nick Bostrom, have banned me from coming up with doomsday weapons during working hours, at least. And the problem is, of course, sometimes if you just mention that it's relatively easy to do something bad, you don't need to say anything more because anybody skilled enough in the art can figure it out. And we also have a very tricky form of information hazard in form of psychological and social risks. When the public or policymaker react in the wrong way to certain pieces of information, we might actually have a reason to be careful about it. Now, the interesting thing about those ones is that you might still need to disseminate the information. After all, research and policy work requires us to tell people true things and building trust. But normally, we actually don't have the right mechanism for handle this, at least not in academia. So, for example, if I do a climate model and find that the climate change is going to be 5% smaller than expected, that's relevant to tell to the IPCC. But I better not tell Fox News, because I can predict very easily how they are going to spin the news, and it's actually going to lead to people reacting in the wrong way. So what can we do? Well, I've been looking into principles in academic work for handling various forms of information hazard. One is actually trying to predict what's likely to produce troublesome information. Sometimes you might just want to avoid researching it. Again, don't invent doomsday weapons just because. Try to come up with the countermeasures for doomsday weapons and don't publish the doomsday weapons. And in many cases, it's the hard to discover piece of puzzle. That step that makes some pathogen go from slightly dangerous to very dangerous, or that step that really gums up the works for handling a pandemic. And this can, of course, change over time. So we better take likely trends into account. And the most interesting thing here is the role of uncertainty. Because the more uncertain we get, the more cautious we should become. Normally, when we talk about things, the conservative thing is to assume that it will not work. If I'm describing my great invention, your best guess is it's probably not going to work if it's that great. If I'm describing a great risk, the careful thing is not to say, yeah, it's unlikely to be that bad. It's to actually take it really seriously, because it might be around and it's a serious risk. That requires actually thinking about how much the information helps good and bad actors. Updating your climate model is going to help the IPCC. It's going to be used propagandistically by climate deniers. We might say that doubts about certain studies, you want to get it into the right academic journals, but maybe not, again, into Fox News. We might want to think here about both unilateral action. If I publish this, what are the effects? If others could publish it, is it maybe a good idea for many of us to hold back a bit until it looks like, okay, enough others have reached the same conclusion, now we can publish it. There might also be economies of scale where many of us should move ahead and spread the information. There are also different ways of disclosing hazardous information. We generally tend to fall into this trap of thinking that it's either publish it everywhere, blog about it, tweet about it, or take it to your grave. Normally, that's not true. Most scientific papers are written in jargon and mostly of interest to scientists rather than the media. And sometimes you might want to write your paper really in a really dry way. Sometimes you might take certain information and put it into escrow or find some regulatory agency to handle that. The problem might be that such agencies don't exist yet. And we really ought to work, especially as academics, of figuring out organizational culture that is careful about thinking about your information hazard. Self-censorship is very common among academics. There are many things we think twice about blogging about or tweeting about or even starting a research project about. And in some cases for good reasons. But in many cases, it's because I did an estimation on my own. I think so. I don't dare to tell anybody because I feel a little bit awkward talking about it. And then the postdocs are noticing that nobody's researching this field and inferring that there is probably something bad about that field. But quite a lot of this self-censorship is based on really shoddy reasoning. It's much better to actually have a proper conversation about what are we not going to be working on? What are we going to be quiet about? What are we going to manage? Even though that is going to require both internal trust and also building a trust with the public. Because if the public knows that academics don't tell you everything they know, that also feels a bit untrustworthy. You actually want to demonstrate that you manage information in a responsible way, which is a cultural thing, and I think we're just at the start of doing this properly. It's easier in domains where people are talking like biosecurity, where there is a bit of tradition. Computer security has developed some tools for it. We are just at the start of doing this when it comes to artificial intelligence. So how do we balance these things? Because it's worth recognizing that biotechnology is a general purpose technology that has amazing, fantastic, beautiful potential to actually help life on Earth and humanity. And it's worth noticing that the right to do research is actually enshrined not just in the German basic law, but the US government has concluded that to the maximum extent possible, the products of fundamental research should remain unrestricted. Most countries think that freedom of inquiry is super important. That, of course, doesn't mean that you should publish everything. Sometimes you can do with security classifications. But you might also, as a responsible moral researcher, handle this in a sensible way. One interesting thing to observe is, again, people tend to react in a binary way and say, well, we should ban the dangerous research. But this rarely works. Historically, it seems that the only cases where we have managed to ban technologies somewhat successfully is that nobody really wants them. But lab automation is wanted. We want biotechnology. Sometimes it's possible to prevent access because you need very special raw materials. There is a high threshold of access. But biotech doesn't have that kind of high threshold. And it also works when there is a fairly firm consensus on what's good and what's bad. While I would be willing to argue about reproductive cloning, I think it actually, people are too negative about it, but still, generally, there is a broad consensus that let's not do that. And yeah, that means that reproductive cloning is not very likely to happen. However, when it comes to much biotechnology, we do have a rather strong difference in opinion about which research does represent good or bad research. Again, the brouhaha about gain of function research for flu and the pandemics is a good example. Many people in the flu and the virology world were very confident that this is great stuff. Other virologists in nearby fields were saying, no, this is really risky. So what can we do? And this is where I think legal norms can work. So one of the findings seems to be that science is much more sensitive to lawfulness than engineering. So while we have a war on drugs that haven't stopped the people from producing and selling drugs very much, actually it has blocked a lot of research about drugs and their effects. And it seems like public institutions, they are much more responsible to the laws that show up than one would expect. And this allows us to actually set standards. This is where it might be possible to construct sticky standards that actually make it easier to do the right thing. It might be that we should look into the possibilities of setting up more legal incentives for creating sensible information as a culture. One possibility might be liability. If it turns out that the pandemic comes from your lab, you should be sued out of existence. And that threat ought to be scary enough to make the dean of your university say, yeah, I want my biotech labs to have very high safety standards and work on stuff that is likely not to cause this endowment to evaporate. It's still going to probably require better forms of traceability. It might be that we want to mandate traceability in biotechnology to a much higher degree. There are already attempts of centralizing a bit of DNA synthesis because economies of scale make it much easier to send an email over the internet and get a test tube in the mail rather than running your own DNA synthesis machine, which means that there is potentially a bottleneck that could scan for dangerous genomes, except that figuring out what a dangerous genome is not entirely easy. Another interesting possibility might be to stimulate differential technology development. That is, if I have a technology that foreseeably could cause trouble, I might actually want to develop another technology that preempt that trouble beforehand. For example, we might want to, at some point, do climate engineering by putting aerosols in the stratosphere. That could be potentially dangerous unless we also had a way of removing stratospheric aerosols. That technology ought to be developed before we get to the actual climate change technology. In the case of biotechnology, this contains various forms of biocontainment technologies, but also ways of mopping up modified organisms. This is something where research funders and lawyers can probably do quite a lot of fun things. There is also possibility to do structured transparency. Again, privacy and openness are not necessarily opposed. We can construct systems that allow us to be more effective After all, bomb-sniffing dogs, in some sense, are intruding on our private lives because they figure out a lot of things from our smell. But they only start barking if they smell explosives. So we accept them because we know how dogs work. We know they're not going to tell their owners also about who our mistresses were and so on. And we might think about similar thing for biotech. If every smartphone had a little sequencer and started raising the alarm if some pathogen showed up, that might be both good for me as a smartphone's owner and a good way for disease control systems, assuming low enough error rates, of course. And it's not like that system, if it was designed in the right way, would intrude on our privacy by sequencing us. But it also shows that we need the right institutions and trust in those institutions for doing that kind of technology. So my final point here, COVID-19 was a dress rehearsal for a really serious pandemic. It's kind of horrible to say that, but we were really lucky this time. There are much more scary coronaviruses out there already, and I can envision much nastier use of my biotechnology. And I think when it comes to our humanity response to COVID, it's kind of there in the middle. It's definitely not great, but it was not a complete disaster. We have a lot of things we have learned here. And it also seems that one of the big problems have been that we have a semi-anarchic international order that probably can't handle this kind of risk, especially if it's deliberately technologically caused very well. In a very provocative paper, Nick Bostrom argues that maybe we're living in a fragile world and there could be some technologies that are just going to destroy civilization if we don't control them as soon as we discover them. So far, it has not happened. Nuclear weapons turn out to be very tricky to make, but maybe in another world, they could have been trivial to make, and in that case, everybody who found out about it could blow up the world. That's not in a safe situation unless there is a way of jointly, globally controlling that. We probably don't live in that fragile world when it comes to biorisk, but it seems like we should start thinking about what kind of international regimes are needed, what ways of actually protecting the global commons. So the day when they can be implemented, because I think the moment right now for building global institutions is not quite here yet. It's not really the season, but it might come surprisingly soon. And I think before that, we need to start thinking carefully about what kind of new institutions, what is WHO 2.0? Is there some other way of protecting the global commons than the United Nations? Could we do that well? And in that case, we should start writing it up. So when the day comes, we can show our papers and the reports to the people and say, we have a plan for this. This is the chance to actually make the world a safer place. Thank you very much. It's been fun talking, and now I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much, Anders. Very, very nice talk. So really, really interesting. Audience is saying that your presentation was excellent, very provocative, very good ideas and very good challenges.
Yeah.
So for us. So we have some question here. Okay. One of them is, it seems you said like the more technologized society, the less biorisks to deal with. So in a post-humanist society, biorisk could disappear? Is it good to move on to a post-humanist world?
I actually gave a talk about a month ago with the title, Will There Ever Be a Last Pandemic? And my suggestion was that in principle, there could very well be that eventually we upload into computers, we have nanotechnological robot bodies, haha, viruses can't beat us anymore. Except of course for those pesky computer viruses. I don't think we're going to run out of problems. Selfish replicators exist in many forms, including ideas in our own mind. So I think what is happening is that we're trading certain risks for other risks. The Black Plague in the Middle in the ages was tremendously destructive and we had no tools to protect ourselves. Before the Middle Ages, if we go sufficiently far back, actually that kind of global pandemic couldn't happen because people didn't move around enough. And the Black Death was actually because of increased communication and the transport. It was enabled by technology. It was enabled by big cities where pestilence could spread well. And then we beat it because we developed other technologies, but we have also developed even more communication. I've seen models of the 1918 flu finding that if it happened today, it would actually not be as bad as in 1918, despite the bigger communications and transport. More people would be infected, but our general health status is better. And we have better hospitals, we have better ways of treating pneumonia. So according to this model, this looked pretty good, except that a lot of it hinged on that pneumonia treatment. It turned out that if antibiotic resistance became common and we got antibiotic resistant pneumonia around the world, suddenly those risks would become much worse. So what is happening is, thanks to advanced technology, we can get rid of some risks. We have beaten smallpox, and now polio looks like it's on the ropes. Great, if we just keep on doing that, we can fix those. We do get these biorisks that emerge. And the race here between things that cause risk and things that reduce risk, I think we have been a bit sloppy about doing this development. I think we need to work more on differential technology development, saying, actually, we want those technologies that reduce the risk earlier than the risk-generating technologies. In some cases, you can't make this because they're so linked to each other. They're tightly coupled. In some cases, you can't predict it. But I think there is probably a fair bit of low-hanging fruit we ought to be working on, long before we become post-human.
Okay, we have another one here from Osama Rakjan. Do you think the United Nations can protect the world in this situation? They are doing well?
I think the United Nations is kind of doing a somewhat crappy job at protecting the world. On the other hand, 200 years ago, nobody would even have believed the idea of a United Nations. It would be part of some utopian story. What? Getting all the kings and queens of Earth to join together diplomatically? It's not practically possible for starters. Now we have the United Nations, which is very flawed. At the same time, it exists. It allows people to talk. It actually does a fair bit of coordination. And I would bet that 200 years in the future, if we're still around, we're going to have the UN++. We are going to have developed these things. But it might have to be organized in a different way. I'm not good at organizational design, but it's pretty clear that, for example, basing it on the concept of national states works up to a point, but it's clear that we somehow need to have Google in the room somewhere. And it's very unclear how to do that. I've been sitting in on the Bioweapons Convention meeting in the outer circle of NGOs and somewhere behind Timor-Leste, and kind of wondering, what can I do here except give information? It seems like some NGOs could actually do way more, and we need to find a way of incorporating that. But that's the fun part. We get to invent and create.
Okay, we have one more here. Let me translate it. It's from Laura Victoria Puentes. Do you think that the consequences of biorisks and technological risks in general can be well managed only by considering the principle of dignity, which is very anthropocentric?
I think a non-anthropocentric concept of dignity is totally possible. Again, Nick Bostrom has written a rather fun paper about post-human dignity, which really annoyed the bioconservatives that had him write it. But you could, of course, start talking about, well, what about the health of the biosphere? Global health as a literal biospheric health and so on. And I think that kind of systems thinking is useful. But then it's easy to get bogged down into start to think about the dignity of carrots, rather than going back to that question, wait a minute, what is dignity about? Oh, being able to make meaningful choices, being able to actually have an open future, etc. Going to the more abstract level, suddenly actually doing global dignity starts looking like a possible thing. It's just that we humans are very unique because we actually can make the choices. I can lecture ethics to my cat all day and it's not going to change its behavior. I can do some operant conditioning on my cat, which is not the really ethical way of getting it to behave. We are right now the only part of Earth's biosphere that actually is doing very much of ethical thinking and having this level of autonomy. I think in the not too far future, we might not be the only part. We might actually be creating software or other biological entities that might also have that. But right now, we're kind of, unfortunately, in charge and have to do the best. But that, of course, doesn't mean that the rest of the biosphere isn't a moral patient in some sense. We actually have a fair bit of duty to make sure that it works well, not just for our own sake, but for its sake.
Yes. So, Roger, Ellen, do you have any question or comment to share?
I'm afraid I was on a different call, so I'm going to catch up later.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Roger.
Sorry, Eric. Yeah, I was just trying to unmute
Yes.
there. Yeah. Well, I heard an awful lot of echoes in Anders' talk. Not just the language of the commons, but I think particularly in those closing remarks about the need to reinvent our international organizations so that they are focused on the right questions in the right kind of way. And I know a lot of people think that this means that you have to have some sort of, there's a trade-off between democratic representation in these kind of institutions and technocratic expertise. And as Anders was just saying there, that you sense that it's not enough just to have the public players around the table, but those, well, particularly as we become more technocratic in our thinking about the solution, that we have to have private parties there who are actually leading the technological developments that we're going to rely on. It's a very different, we have to imagine a very different kind of organization, I think. And that said, I sense that the most important thing is to have people with the right kind of will, the right kind of integrity. It doesn't matter what sort of institution you have, if people can be corrupted or captured or, you know, but somewhere the solution lies in redesigning these international institutions and staffing them with people who are focused on doing the right thing. Yeah, but not in my lifetime, I think.
Yeah, I think incentive design is interesting. If you can get the incentives right, that's also going to draw the right kind of people or even create them inside the organization. The problem is, so far we have demonstrated in a lot of interesting ways that how you can get incentives wrong. It's just, you can look around for almost any organization to see how slightly wrong incentives create a lot of weird pathology. I think we need to get better at this. But again, yeah, we need to try that. And I think there is a lot of progress that can be made because we do understand Goodhart's law a bit better. We have seen past pathologies, so we're not going to make those mistakes. We're going to get to do new and exciting mistakes.
Alberto? Tu micrófono.
Thank you so much, Anders, for your terrific presentation, and have a question in same line of the Roger. What do you think about the incentives may exist to create an international regime when biotech and bio-risk is as an instrument or tool of domination, one country to other country?
Yeah, so I have some experience for seeing the bioweapons convention, which of course the cynical view is the nuclear powers liked that one because at least they don't have to worry about bioweapons. So they supported the development of a strong consensus that we shouldn't have bioweapons. That might or might not be a correct description, but it's a good thing that we have a bioweapons convention. Many intentions can be woven together. The fun thing is that many people in industry and academia are taking up the slack from governments, I think. The biohacking community are amazingly ethical, I think, in most part. They have developed voluntary codes that they actually seem to adhere to fairly well to try to make sure that the FBI is on their side, that they actually are helpful. I think what is happening right now, we have a bit of vacuum of ideas in the governance. But we see a lot of interesting attempts of self-regulation in industry. We see a lot of it in AI because government attempts at making sensible stuff about artificial intelligence right now is relatively limited. The problem is, of course, that might not be enough. Self-regulation is lovely and nice, but the incentives tend to tilt it over time. Do you want to catch it before it starts tilting too much? I do think that there is an opening here. There's kind of a vacuum that we want to fill here with some new ideas. Maybe experiment with institutions, maybe send out a few test balloons, especially when the weather for international cooperation gets better again, which I'm hopeful it will relatively soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Anders. Thank you
you.
very much. We put our hands together for you. Thank you very, thank you very much for your terrific talk. And thank you very much for being sharing with us right now. Thanks a lot. Okay, let's move on to our next speaker, who is Professor Ellen Wright-Clayton. Professor Clayton is Cray Weber Professor of Pediatrics, Professor of Law, and Professor of Health Policy at Vanderbilt University in the United States. She also is an internationally respected leader, particularly in the field of law and genetics. Professor Clayton's scholarship, for example, currently focuses on the translation of genomics to clinical care. She has published 2 books, according to my information, and more than 175 scholarly articles and chapters in medical journals, interdisciplinary journals, and law journals on the intersection of law, medicine, and public health. She is member of the International Network of Biolaw. Professor Wright-Clayton will give the talk, Challenges in Vaccine Allocation and Uptake. Ellen, you are deeply welcome. Thank you very much for being sharing with us right now and having accepted this invitation. Please go ahead with your talk. Thanks, Ellen.
Well, thank you. It's absolutely great to be here. And let me see if I can advance my slides. I am going to focus my comments today primarily on the situation regarding SARS-CoV-2 in the United States, in part because it's the case with which I'm most familiar, and because it highlights some of the conflicts and I would argue mistakes that are being made. And I hope that this presentation will be instructive for others. I do acknowledge that the impact of vaccine nationalism and inequity of access that are almost certainly going to occur internationally are really important. It's not what I'm going to focus on. But what I want to begin by making an observation here, which is that the debate in the United States does not mention autonomy, does not mention dignity, does not mention solidarity. It does touch on responsibility. It does say something about being all in it together. But I was particularly interested as I listened to Roger's talk at the beginning about how focusing just within within bioethics and biolaw, I think is actually causing us to make some big mistakes as we're talking going forward. I would also mention that I've been very involved with COVID-19 here in the United States on 2 different levels. One is that I'm involved with a body that's making policy recommendations for Tennessee, in which the state I live in. And the other part is that I am the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine here in the United States has been publishing a lot of work on this pandemic. And I've been pretty involved with all of that. So that's what's informing, those experiences are informing some of what I'm going to talk about today. So in terms of, as I said, I'm going to talk about allocation and uptake. So let's talk first about what's going on in allocation. One of the things that I have been noticing is that there is a failure to recognize what's at stake. There is a lot of attention in the debate going on in the United States about saying that we need to protect those at high risk. Number one on almost everybody's list is healthcare providers. But the next ones on the list are the elderly, which I now count as, and those with comorbidities. And the idea seems to be that really the goal of what we're doing with the vaccine is keeping people from keeping people from getting seriously ill or dying. So that's one set of goals, but it's not the only set of goals. The other thing that is getting less attention is the importance about slowing or stopping the transmission of disease. This is, or at least that seems to be an aspect of this. Now, we also are doing an unbelievably bad job of masking and social distancing in many parts of the country, including the one in which I live. But the idea seems to be that if we can just get a vaccine, the disease will go away. But they also, in terms of this, are not talking about who actually has the disease and who's spreading the disease, because the data are overwhelming that it's not elderly who get this disease, in part because for the most part, they're like me and haven't left their house in several months, but rather it's young adults. The overwhelming majority of cases in the United States occur for people who are between the ages of 21 and 40. And there's beginning to be some evidence that that actually older adolescents may be playing a major role in this as well. And so, so one strategy that's really not being paid much attention to is that if you wanted the disease to stop being transmitted, you would give it to the people who are transmitting it, who are young adults, as opposed to other people. But the other possibility for allocation here that's not getting enough emphasis, in my view, is the idea of creating the possibility of more social interaction. This cuts in the direction, obviously, against the policies of masking and social distancing. But one of the things that is increasingly coming into our dialogue in this country is not only the need to get people back to work, but more particularly the need to get our kids back in school. And the reason for that, in part, is so their parents can go back to work, but importantly, because developmentally, keeping kids from interaction with others, particularly when they're young, and particularly when they're in the early stages of education, actually causes, we are pretty sure that it causes long-term harm. The other thing that I would mention here, and this I want to pick up on something that Roger said, is that there are major externalities in this country that affect who's getting sick and why. And so if we just look at risk of the disease itself, we will miss the opportunity to identify and to address issues like systemic racism, issues like the enormous income disparity that determine who is getting sick or not. We know in this country that that people who are underrepresented minorities are much more likely to get sick, are much more likely to become ill. And the reason for that has less to do with the virus itself or even genetics, although there may be some small role there, and has everything to do with the fact that I can shelter at home and they can't, that they are more likely to live in multi-generational housing so that there may be more ways for them to get ill, that they are more consigned to public transportation, which I am not. And so one of the things that we are beginning to pay some attention to, albeit not enough attention to, is that a major criterion that we ought to use for allocating vaccine may be to redress the impact of pre-existing disparities in our country that we have yet to face up to. So those are some of the issues here. What would we do if we want to prioritize those at risk of developing serious disease? It leads us to identify or to involve those in delivering health care, the elderly, and those with pre-existing conditions. And as we talk about that, there's varying debate about how we think about essential workers. We tend to think that physicians and nurses are more essential than the people who actually clean up the rooms of people who have these diseases, and more essential than the workers who make sure that we have groceries or the other things that we need to have, or basic infrastructure, or the other things that we need to have to thrive as people like me are sheltering in place. And so at least some people are arguing that maybe we should place greater priority on those who are essential workers who provide the infrastructure, and perhaps less on the elderly. Now, I have to say that gets immediate pushback in our country, but some of the major proponents of that view are Dan Callahan, who led the Hastings Center here, my colleague Larry Churchill. Zeke Emanuel did so in a very provocative way. But I think that there are some real questions there about how much we want to focus just on avoiding serious disease. What if we want to? What do we do if we want to stop spread the virus? And I want to make the point here that it's almost weird that this has gotten such a small role, because in fact that has always been a goal of vaccination. And indeed, in some cases, it is the primary goal. The reason that we immunize children against rubella, German measles, is not because it's a particularly bad disease in little kids. It's not. The reason we immunize the kids against that disease is so that they don't affect pregnant women whose fetuses then can develop rubella embryopathy, which is really bad. So the idea of protecting others has always been a goal, but it's one that we are, that is not getting as much play in our current discussion. And as I said, we would immunize the people who are spreading it, who are mostly young adults and maybe older adolescents. One of the things that I would point out is that we in the United States are not collecting data on who's actually sick. Part of the problem with that is we collect data on a state basis, and states do it differently. So I know what the data are in Tennessee. More than 50% of the people who are sick are between 21 and 40. That I know. I just don't know in the rest of the country. One issue that people talk a lot about in this country is if we were to focus on immunizing young adults, would this create an issue of moral hazard, since they're also the ones who by and large aren't wearing masks, who aren't social distancing? We are in the United States, our colleges and universities are opening instead of including hours. And one of the debates that we're having in this country, is it even reasonable to ask young college students to act the same way those of us on this call would with regard to masking and social distancing, because in fact, their brains aren't developed enough to do it. And one of the reasons that you go to university, at least in this country, is in part because of the interaction. And so it's a completely different experience to go to university and not be able to, make new friends and see your friends and be close. And so one of the concerns that we raise in this country is if people get immunization, which will not be perfect, it will not be perfect, is it going to free these young adults up to think that they no longer have to do the other parts of prevention that we think are so important? And then the other question that we would ask is, what if the goal is promoting future well-being? And I've alluded to this already, but one of the things that is talked about a lot in allocating vaccine in this country is the focus is almost exclusively, is someone going to get sick? And are they going to die? And how sick are they going to get? Those are really important things, but they are not the only important things. I mean, I have to say that from my personal calculus, avoiding getting sick is really, really important. But the fact of the matter is, the reason I can tolerate this kind of, this kind of sheltering in place is that, first of all, I have someone who can do my shopping and do other things for me, but much more importantly, I can do almost all my work on Zoom. I spend hours a day on Zoom. I connect with people on Zoom, but I can do almost everything that I do this way. But there are other people who can't do what they do this way. And I made the point about kids earlier. And so there's been a big debate in this country about, how important it is to get kids back to school because of its harm to the children cognitively and socially, and also because it helps adults get back to their own lives. And it also allows us the opportunity, although I don't put this here, to address some of the harms that are created by the social cultural practices that exist in this country as a result of poverty and unconscious racism. So one of the things that because you do different things depending on what you're trying to do, it's really important to recognize that these goals, preventing death, stopping virus, allowing people to get more back into the activities of daily living that they need to do face-to-face, these things don't align. And they call for different allocation strategies, as I've just outlined. And so one of the things that I see happening here is that I think it's critical that we be clear about the trade-offs, but we have not really seen that yet. And so, so one of the things we're involved right now in developing vaccine allocation guidelines in the national academies, and making those trade-offs more explicit is one of the things that we need to do. Then in addition, we have anti-discrimination laws that apply on their face and as applied can limit certain options. But here, I think it's important to look not only at what these laws say, but what they actually, what they would actually accomplish. So for instance, would prioritizing young adults and children in access to vaccines violate the Age Discrimination Act? I think you can make an argument that it doesn't, but I think that that's something that we have to talk about in this country. We have laws in this country that prohibit discrimination on the base on race, ethnicity, and alienage. And the ways that they're often applied is to say, but we in this country have a deeply divided debate about how those are to be applied. As we talk about affirmative action, for example, as we talk about right now, our leading educational institutions in this country are being sued on the grounds that giving preference to minorities actually disadvantages people like me, people like my children, and Asian Americans. And so the idea that an anti-discrimination law on the basis of race and ethnicity is somehow going to act to the benefit of underrepresented minorities is by no means clear. Because in fact, those laws as applied often are used to say, no, you can't benefit underrepresented minorities because that's illegal. So I think that we need to look at how these anti-discrimination laws are what they say, but also how they're applied, because I think it's going to cut in a variety of different directions. I also want to say just a few words about challenges in uptake in the United States. This is a recent Gallup poll. And by the way, I will provide these slides to Alberto and Erick for anybody who wants them. So I'm just saying that. But it was a recent Gallup poll that that looks at what people would do if we had an FDA approved COVID-19 vaccine that was safe. Now, whether people are going to believe the FDA in this country is by no means clear at the moment, since they're under political attack, but let's assume all that is true. And if you could get it for free, okay? So the best possible situation, effective, safe, free. And a third of Americans say they wouldn't do it. And who's reluctant? Who's reluctant are Republicans. Only about half of them say they would do it. People who are not white are less enthusiastic about doing it. Again, this without a doubt reflects two things. One, the history of abuse the history of abuse in research of minorities in this country, and the history of lack of access to healthcare of minorities in this country. And the fact is that they're having a hard time recruiting minorities to be in these studies. And so, as is so often the case in the United States, we will have really good evidence about efficacy in whites, and we won't have it about anybody else. So, and it's not in this case for want of trying, but it's hard to overcome the past. It's interesting that people who are slightly younger than me are the most reluctant to do this. I think one really good bit of news here is that actually young people are pretty doggone enthusiastic about this, which is just spectacular in my view. And then rural Americans are less interested in doing this. This may change as COVID is now entering the rural United States. In the state where I live, they're the hot spots, not the cities like Nashville or Memphis. But the truth is, this takes part of just an enormous socio-political divide between rural and urban in the United States. I mean, it's hard to understate the importance of that particular socio-political divide in this country. So, so there are a lot of reasons. I think all of these things that we see here about reluctance about uptake are the confluence of several factors. One is that there are growing distrust from many sources, some new, some old. It is just astonishing to see the all-out attack on the Food and Drug Administration that we're seeing right now. And the deep concern that, a vaccine is going to get approved before it's ready and before we have enough information. I mean, this is really terrifying. In addition, we have a backdrop of growing vaccine hesitancy in this country. As a general pediatrician, which is what my training is, and as actually the chair of a committee that the academies did about a decade ago looking at vaccine safety, it is breathtaking what a success vaccines have been in terms of health. And yet we are seeing just enormous hesitancy. This is only going to make it worse. And then more generally, the general distrust in science. I mean, so even if everything were perfect, this isn't going to be, this would be a real problem. And then finally, we see just a profound distrust of government in this country. And again, going back to Roger's talk, I had to step out for just a few minutes to do something else, but he made a number of important points. I think the United States is, I won't say unique, but is peculiar in its notion, not so much of autonomy. I mean, I don't think they care so much autonomy. What they care about is freedom, or the ability to do what they want, when they want, regard for others. And I don't see that as autonomy particularly. And the notions of individualism and self-reliance in the American narrative. And this leads many in the present moment to reject other offers to protect others, measures to protect others, such as masking and social distancing. It is really amazing. I mean, the idea that we have obligations to protect others is really is hard to come by. And then, of course, as I've already mentioned, the long history of systemic racism, which is understandably going to cause some of those who are most at risk for this disease, in fact, to be most hesitant to take these vaccines. So I think that addressing these complex array of factors to increase uptake is going to be challenging. I mean, I put these slides together last week, and now with the frontal assault on the FDA, I think it's going to be even harder. But I think it's going to be a tremendous issue. And it would make more difficult efforts to mandate vaccination. We mandate vaccines for kids for the most part, but this has not been required in this country by the government in more than a century. And so, where I mean, this sounds, well, this is discouraging. I was going to say it sounds discouraging. It is discouraging. But this is where, this is where I think we are in the United States. And I guess that we, what I would say, to use a literary metaphor, is that we are reaping the whirlwind at this point. That the pandemic has had the effect of uncovering some of those things that have been brewing in our country now for decades or even centuries. And it's going to be a real challenge for us to do this. But the way we're going to have to do this is that we are going to have to talk about things like solidarity, not a part of the American lexicon, I should say US lexicon, not a part of the US lexicon, talk about responsibility for others. And this is going to be really challenging to do in our current socio-political moment. So, so I guess that's what I had to say so far. And so now if people have comments or questions, I would be delighted to try to respond.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Terrific talk. People is saying that this was an excellent presentation. So you have provided very, very important and interesting criteria for vaccine allocation and other issues related to pandemic. We have a question here from Natalia Pedraza. She said that if you consider that biodefense, I think that she means a kind of a state biodefense or structural biodefense, biodefense is an alternative to deal with this kind of situations.
I think that's a really interesting, a really interesting notion. I mean, we like to use war metaphors in the United States. And so that ought to invoke a notion of biodefense. And I think that it will be, whether it actually takes hold, I think will be that will be an interesting challenge in this country. I mean, and so given that, at least in some parts of our country, we have a hard time even having people engage in personal protective behaviors, whether people will be willing to take the message to go get the vaccine, I think is a really open question. We've made progress on that in the case of flu. And I wanted to make a historical note here. I was a child when the oral polio vaccine became available. And the response to oral polio vaccine in this country was astonishing. I mean, I remember standing in lines that went down blocks to get my oral polio vaccine because people were so afraid of it. And very, very, very vivid to me. And I think the distinction between how people thought about that in in the late 1950s versus how people think about that now is absolutely remarkable to me. I think, maybe it's because our parents lived through World War II and the Depression. Maybe they were more trusting of their government. Eisenhower was a more likable guy than our current president. I don't really know, but we really need to get this idea that we have to lick this thing. We have a quarter of the cases in the world. That's embarrassing. And it's because we're not doing the right things. And so I think the idea of talking biodefense to say, we have to do this as a country to beat this could be attractive. So far it hadn't worked, but I like the idea.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. We have one more question here. So if you had to establish a hierarchy of immunization, who we should immunize the first? Young adults, since they are spreading the virus? What about elderlies or people with comorbidities?
So I think that what I would say is that I think what we're going to end up is, where I hope we'll end up, is that we will pay some attention. We will pay some attention to elderly and comorbidities. I think we will, I would say that I'm not going to rush to get the vaccine. I have to tell you that I would be delighted to get out of my house. I've been here since March. But at the end of the day, there are other people who need it more than me. I can stay here. And I think people with comorbidities, need to be thinking about the extent to which they can protect themselves given where they are. If I were, but I'm not only 68, I also happen to be in a particularly privileged social situation that I can do this. And so I think what we're going to have to do is have sort of a sliding scale where it says that we, first of all, one bit of good news today is that Moderna vaccine, the one that's being done here, actually turns out to work in older people so far. That leads to be the signal. Most vaccines don't work in older people, so that's fantastic news. But I think we will make a mistake if we say you do healthcare providers first, you do elderly second, and comorbidity second, and only when you've got them all done do you do young adults. I think that's a mistake. I think that the calculus about who's most at risk of becoming sick and who's most at risk of making other people sick is actually going to be a more complex calculus than that, and we're going to have to take all those factors into account.
Okay, thankfully, I'm not at risk because I'm so young still,
Roger is raising his hand.
Roger, go ahead.
I'm sorry to, but yeah, I just wanted to make sure I got this question in because I have to leave in a few minutes. But I must just tell you, Ellen, that my paper really comes from a paper I've written with a colleague, which is about parents acting as proxies to give consent for their children in the context of a dispute between the parents and healthcare professionals. And I wonder, so one scenario would be a vaccine is developed for COVID and it's mandated by law to be administered to children. But if 30% of American adults would not want to have the vaccine for themselves, should we assume that they would not also want to have the vaccine for their children? And would there then be a pushback against this from the parents saying no to vaccines for their children?
Without a doubt, without a doubt. And I think that that's going to be, I think that's going to be a tremendous issue. I mean, a tremendous problem.
Yeah.
And so and you see what happened in California. I mean, every state in the United States just about had a religious exemption to vaccines, which was a result of something from the Nixon administration. Haldeman got that put into law there. Roger, I've written a fair amount about kids too, but but you know, California, 10% of the kids in this country just repealed the religious exemption to vaccines because they just couldn't stand the measles outbreaks. And so, so this is not a God-given right, you know, to do this. It's not a God-given right to be in the world and do whatever you want and pose risk to others. Now, in the United States right now, I think we're going the other way, but I think it is certainly the position that I take on this issue.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much.
That's awesome. Thank you for raising that.
Another question here. So what do you think about the American policies to deal with the virus? Actually, is there any policy in America to fight against the pandemic?
Not at the federal level. Lots of states are doing lots of things, and some of them are being more effective than others. I think the fact that what you see in the Northeast, that after that huge pandemic, they've really done a lot to shut things down. I think the real mystery state is California because they've tried really hard and it's a mess out there. And Tennessee is one of these states that believes in individual freedom, and so that's a bit of a challenge. But there's no unifying policy, and really this goes to a point that you were making earlier, Anders. To the extent that this is working, it's partly working because individuals are deciding that they want to take on responsibility and try to make things better. I mean, because ultimately the things that we are doing in this country require that individuals decide to take on responsibility. And lots of people are doing that. Some people aren't. But you're absolutely right that we don't have a unified response.
Okay, Alberto, you have a question?
Thank you so much for your presentation, your talk, Helen. Do you believe that the measures such as a ban of attending schools or going to the workplace can be applied to force vaccination in USA?
Oh, I think as a legal matter, we absolutely can mandate vaccination. I mean, I think that Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which was decided by the Supreme Court, a long time in the early 20th century, I think makes that clear. I think we can clearly immunize kids because we've been doing that for a really long time. I think the question is just going to be whether there's the political will to do that. And then the other thing that I think is going to be a big challenge in the United States is going to be whether individual employers can require that. As a physician, I have to have a flu vaccine every year as a condition of employment. That is controversial in this country. And so there are those who say that it will violate the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think that if people are, I think if people are going to be made sick by the vaccine, then obviously they shouldn't have to take it. But I think that, but I think that that's where I think the state can do things. I think the extent, I don't think this administration will. And I think where the big debate's going to be where the vaccines are available and when it's actually widely available to use for other people, for everybody, is going to be whether employers can require it. And if so, what the exceptions are going to be, and worse, whether the employers are going to grab it all up and use it for their employees and therefore not have enough available to people who are even more at risk. So those are some of the allocation issues that I think we can clearly foresee in the United States.
Okay. Another one, when do you think a vaccine will be ready to be applied? Do we have to wait much longer still?
When I think it's really going to be applied, I mean, or really ready, end of the year, early next year. When are they going to declare that one's ready? Before the election.
All right.
No, I mean, that's what people are worried about. But the thing about vaccines is that they have to be effective, but they have to be safe. And this is such a huge issue. I mean, the safety profile of currently available vaccines is astonishing. And the reason for that is that people don't remember polio. They don't remember that. I guess they do remember measles now, but they're astonishingly safe, and they have to be astonishingly safe. Because people remember swine. Some people remember swine flu. The reason we use injectable polio vaccine in this country, and I'm sure in all of yours, is that the oral polio vaccine, while it's really, really safe, occasionally causes wild-type polio. And that's intolerable when in the Western Hemisphere, native polio has been gone for 20 years. You have to have zero risk to do polio vaccine in this. I mean, what do we do that has zero risk? Nothing. But it has essentially zero risk. And so the idea of rushing this, rushing this into production and into giving it to jillions of people before we know that it's safe, has the unbelievable capacity to backfire. I hear that the vaccine is what we call reactogenic, or some of the vaccines that are being tested now are reactogenic. That means that it makes you feel bad after you get the shot. And so, I mean, those things really have to be taken into account. But if it does something like swine flu and causes Guillain-Barré or whatever, that'll be the end of the game. So I do think it's going to be, I am not going to be rushing to take the vaccine because I want to make darn sure that it's safe. And as I said, I have other mechanisms to protect myself, for which I am very thankful on a daily basis. But I think it's going to take a while.
Okay, Ellen. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for your talk. It was a great talk. So thank you very much for being sharing with us, Ellen. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Okay. Yes. Don't forget that we are recording this conference, so all the talks will be available on our website and on our Facebook. I already got your email with the link, Anders. Thank you very much. I'm going to share it. Thanks a lot. So, and for the audience, please don't forget to look at the bottom of the screen and click on the word YouTube. You will be taken right away into a YouTube channel where you can watch the event and write your question like on a chat. I have to warn you that if you remain on the university platform, you'll watch the seminar without any problem, but you won't be able to ask. So if you want to ask, please go into the YouTube channel right away. So let's move on to our next speaker, Alberto.
Gracias, Erick. Bueno, tengo ahora el placer de presentarles a un última conferencista de nuestro webinar. Es la profesora Andrea Macía, es una jurista muy destacada en España, tiene a su haber ya dos libros interesantes en materias de responsabilidad médica, ha escrito mucho sobre temas relativos al diagnóstico preimplantacional y prenatal, y también sobre temas relativos a las técnicas de reproducción asistida. Su último trabajo, titulado Diagnóstico genético preimplantacional y la responsabilidad médica por falsos negativos, fue premiado hace 2 años en el quinto Premio Nacional de Derecho a la Salud en España. Ella es también, como los conferencistas anteriores, miembro de nuestra red internacional de bioderecho. Y bueno, es un placer tenerte con nosotros, Andrea, desde España.
Muchas gracias, Juan Alberto. No sé si se me escucha.
Se te escucha perfecto y
Muchas
tienes
gracias.
que compartir pantalla.
Vale. Bueno, pues gracias, Juan Alberto, por la presentación, la amable presentación. Eso de jurista de reconocido prestigio me ha gustado. No sé yo si será compartido o no en España. En mi casa sí. En todo caso, gracias, como digo, gracias por el soporte técnico de albergar esta jornada de hoy. Buenos días a todos los oyentes de América. Good morning a los oyentes ingleses. Sorry for not being able to speak in English, but my mother tongue would be better in this case. Así que vamos a mantenernos en español dando la nota hispana de esta primera parte de la jornada. Quería comenzar agradeciendo también a Erick Valdés por la iniciativa compartida de estas jornadas y por la oportunidad que nos ha brindado de compartir este panel impresionante de oradores al que me sumo humildemente. Voy a intentar compartir el escritorio y compartir una presentación que había preparado. Supongo que se
ve perfecto. Ahora puedes ponerla.
Vale. Espera, porque justamente estaba en la última diapositiva, estaba ya dando las gracias en vez de decir los buenos días. Bien, en lo que tenía que hablar yo, o de lo que me había propuesto hablar, tiene que ver con el parámetro de la lex artis. Está relacionada de alguna forma con el tema general de las charlas, desde el momento en que la situación de pandemia, una de las cosas que ha puesto de relieve ha sido la crisis sanitaria que ha afectado y afecta todavía hoy, y creo que durante un tiempo, a gran parte de los países. Crisis sanitaria en la que lo que se ha puesto de relieve en muchas ocasiones ha sido un déficit en la atención sanitaria prestada a los enfermos, tanto de coronavirus como de cualquier otro tipo de enfermedad, que no han tenido el acceso adecuado, el acceso deseado a la atención sanitaria para la curación o al menos paliar los efectos de las enfermedades que padecían, y que en esa medida han visto de alguna manera vulnerada su dignidad, su autonomía decisoria a la hora de poder adoptar cualquier tipo de medidas de atención o medidas de acceso a la atención médica. Y en ese sentido es en lo que se enlaza este tema con el contexto general. Esa falta de atención o esa atención deficiente, en última instancia, quien la ha proporcionado o dejado de proporcionar son los profesionales sanitarios. Los profesionales sanitarios que en ese contexto de falta de medios, en ese contexto de desconocimiento de la enfermedad, se ven abocados a adoptar decisiones, no siempre quizás las mejores, pero son las que tienen a su mano, las que pueden de alguna forma adoptar. Pero por el lado de los pacientes puede haber situaciones de frustración porque no acceden a la mejor atención posible, porque su dolencia no es curada, porque su enfermedad no es atendida. Y esa situación o esa sensación de frustración está comprobado que se suele traducir en un plazo más o menos largo en demandas de responsabilidad. ¿Por qué? Porque se busca alguien a quien cargar con ese daño que uno ha sufrido, con esa impotencia que uno ha sentido, y ese alguien que está en primera línea cuando hablamos de la salud y de la vida de las personas son los médicos. Por eso, porque es muy probable que empiece una avalancha de este tipo de demandas en un futuro a medio plazo, creo que es interesante evaluar el parámetro con el que ha de medirse esa atención que ha sido prestada por los profesionales médicos a lo largo de esta crisis durante estos 6-8 meses, según lo midamos o desde cuándo lo midamos. Y por eso, de todos los elementos de la responsabilidad que habría que analizar para ver si esas potenciales demandas de responsabilidad llegan al puerto que quieren los los pacientes o sus familiares, creo que es, como digo, el parámetro de comportamiento del médico el que merece más la pena tener en cuenta. Y ese parámetro de comportamiento es el que se mide por la lex artis. Determinar la lex artis no es una cuestión sencilla, y aquí por eso quiero hacer una serie de advertencias o aclaraciones previas que tienen que ver con algunas ideas que hay que mantener claras en la cabeza de cara a esta charla que estoy proponiendo. La primera de las ideas es que es difícil dar respuestas generales. Es difícil decir que un comportamiento es diligente o es negligente, o que si el médico hace esta serie de pasos va a estar libre de toda responsabilidad, mientras que si se separa de estos pasos va a ser responsable. ¿Por qué? Porque en el ámbito de la responsabilidad médica lo que hay que ver es el caso concreto. Hay que ver qué circunstancias se producían en ese caso, en el paciente, en el momento en el que se presta la atención médica, en cuanto a los medios de que se disponían, para poder determinar si definitivamente el profesional médico que actuó de una determinada forma fue diligente o negligente. De manera que yo aquí no voy a dar una fórmula matemática para determinar esto es diligente y esto es negligente, sino que lo que pretendo es hacer una serie de reflexiones o llamar la atención sobre una serie de puntos que deberían tenerse en cuenta para llevar a cabo esta valoración del comportamiento de los profesionales sanitarios en la atención prestada a los enfermos durante la crisis del COVID-19. La segunda puntualización es que mis reflexiones se centran en esta pandemia actual. Y no en cualquier tipo de pandemia, porque aunque en todo tipo de pandemia hay un elemento común, que es el de lo que se llama medicina de catástrofe, en este caso concreto, la circunstancia que se nos presenta viene fuertemente marcada por el hecho de que la enfermedad es nueva y desconocida. No digo que esto sea irrepetible o que no se haya producido anteriormente. Lo que digo es que, a diferencia de otras posibles enfermedades generalizadas que también hayan podido ser caracterizadas de pandemia en su momento, o que hayan llegado a ese estadio por parte en la calificación de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, la diferencia de esta situación es que, al ser la enfermedad desconocida, la reacción del sistema sanitario es de absoluta imprevisión. No es lo mismo, por ejemplo, que ocurre con el cólera, que se puede desatar de manera periódica o eventualmente en países de África, en los que igualmente hay una avalancha de pacientes, pero la enfermedad es de tal forma conocida que ya hay previsión de acopio de materiales, acopio de espacios para albergar a los enfermos, etc. Por tanto, la valoración del comportamiento de los profesionales médicos en este caso va fuertemente marcado por ese evento de la novedad y el desconocimiento de la enfermedad a la que nos enfrentamos. En tercer lugar, la valoración que voy a proponer de la lex artis se puede aplicar a todo acto médico, o se debe aplicar a todo acto médico que se haya realizado durante la pandemia, que se haya visto influido por razón de la pandemia. Y con esto, ¿qué quiero puntualizar? Que no necesariamente solo se ha de aplicar a enfermos de COVID. También puede haberse visto influido, y de hecho se han visto influidos por razón de la pandemia, otros enfermos que, por ejemplo, han recibido altas tempranas, han recibido, o más bien, se les han cancelado intervenciones, se les ha retrasado asistencia, se les ha negado asistencia por estar destinados los medios humanos y materiales a la atención de enfermos con COVID. Los profesionales médicos que han desarrollado esas actuaciones o que han cometido, entre comillas, esas omisiones, para valorar su parámetro de conducta, tendremos que tener en cuenta la situación de pandemia, pero solo en ese contexto, es decir, solo cuando la negligencia o la defectuosa atención se haya debido a la pandemia o se haya generado por la pandemia. No cualquier acto médico desarrollado durante la pandemia tiene esta valoración específica de la lex artis. Si, por ejemplo, un paciente se ha sido sometido a una operación durante la pandemia y se le ha amputado la pierna derecha en vez de la izquierda, el hecho de que se haya producido durante la pandemia es absolutamente irrelevante, es una situación negligente en cualquier contexto. Pero si no se le ha dado un respirador porque ese respirador estaba aplicado a un enfermo de COVID, ahí sí tenemos que ese enfermo que a lo mejor lo que padecía era otro tipo de dolencia, nada relacionado con la COVID, sí se ha visto afectado por la pandemia, y el enjuiciamiento del parámetro de conducta del médico que le ha atendido tendrá que ceñirse a estos parámetros. La última puntualización tiene que ver con que es muy tentador valorar generalmente el comportamiento de los profesionales sanitarios a posteriori, es decir, una vez que comprobamos que una determinada actuación adoptada no ha funcionado, se puede tender a pensar que era negligente inicialmente. Y eso es una valoración incorrecta. La valoración de la negligencia se tiene que realizar ex ante, a priori, es decir, planteada la situación del enfermo con sus determinadas circunstancias, el parámetro de conducta que hay que tener en cuenta para compararlo con el que ha desarrollado el profesional médico es el de un médico medio en esas circunstancias, no por el resultado o por los efectos de la decisión adoptada. Por tanto, lo que en ocasiones consideramos errores médicos, porque los calificamos como errores por los efectos negativos sobre la salud o la vida del enfermo, no necesariamente son situaciones de negligencia. Negligencia hay cuando el médico no realiza el comportamiento que un médico medio habría realizado en esas mismas circunstancias. Hechas estas puntuaciones, entonces lo primero que hay que definir o de lo que habría que partir es de indicar qué es la lex artis, es decir, qué es ese parámetro de conducta sobre el que se mide el comportamiento de los médicos. La lex artis es un baremo, es un parámetro de comparación, es una pauta de conducta que marca cuál es el comportamiento que debe seguir un médico en la atención de un enfermo concreto en un determinado caso. Si el médico realiza en ese acto médico ese comportamiento tal como lo habría realizado ese profesional sanitario medio, buen profesional sanitario, razonable según los distintos países miden este parámetro de conducta. Si se adapta a ese parámetro de conducta, su actuación es diligente, si no, su actuación es negligente. Por tanto, la lex artis médica nos sirve para medir cuándo el médico es negligente y, por tanto, puede ser objeto de responsabilidad. En esta medición o en la fijación de este parámetro de conducta realmente es compleja porque no está determinado, no está fijado, no está positivizado en ninguna parte. Y de hecho, a menudo se señala que a esta complejidad contribuye el hecho de que realmente el término lex artis es polisémico, es decir, tiene distintas acepciones o nos sirve para identificar distintos referentes. En concreto, se suele identificar dos niveles, y con eso vamos a trabajar en los minutos que siguen, dos niveles de la lex artis. Por un lado, la lex artis se ve como un parámetro general, es decir, cuál es el nivel de conocimientos técnicos que se exigen que maneje un médico medio, qué tiene que dominar, qué tiene que conocer, qué tiene que saber. Ese parámetro se suele identificar o se suele completar, determinar cuál es en cada caso, con las publicaciones científicas, conferencias, protocolos, y eso es lo que determina cuál es el estado de la ciencia, es decir, qué es lo que tiene que conocer un buen médico para actuar. Y ese parámetro nos fija lo que tiene que conocer y, en negativo, lo que puede válidamente desconocer, porque no forma parte del estado de la ciencia. Y, por tanto, si lo desconoce y realiza algo que entra dentro de eso que no se conoce por el estado de la ciencia, su comportamiento puede seguir siendo diligente. Al mismo tiempo, ese parámetro general también nos sirve para identificar cuál es el volumen de información que el médico tiene que dar al enfermo previamente a la realización de un acto médico. Tiene que informarlo de aquello que forma parte del estado de la ciencia, no de lo que nadie conoce. Como segundo nivel de la lex artis, ese parámetro general se concreta en el acto médico específico que se va a realizar en el paciente concreto y se tienen en cuenta como lex artis ad hoc las circunstancias del paciente, las circunstancias del momento o del tiempo del que dispone el médico para llevar a cabo esa actuación y del lugar en la que lo realiza, es decir, los medios de que dispone, etc. Ese parámetro del lex artis ad hoc, segundo escalón, básicamente lo que va a hacer es modalizar y en cierto modo puede permitir relajar el conjunto de saberes que forman parte del estado de la ciencia. No todos son exigibles, por ejemplo, a un médico rural de un pueblo perdido de, digo, Castilla-La Mancha, por decir algo que me queda cercano en España. Esos dos niveles, el problema que tenemos cuando nos enfrentamos a cómo medirlos en un contexto de pandemia es que la pandemia genera obstáculos añadidos a la tarea ya de por sí difícil de determinar el estado de la ciencia y de determinar la actuación concreta exigible para un caso específico. Desde el punto de vista general, vamos a ver ahora, y voy a dedicarme a eso, vamos a ver que la fijación del estado de la ciencia se complica enormemente en esta situación de pandemia y que nos encontramos ante una situación de inexistencia de protocolos que nos dificulta comparar el comportamiento del médico con algo ya preestablecido que nos haga fácil esa identificación de si lo que ha hecho el médico estaba correcto o incorrecto. Desde el punto de vista de la lex artis ad hoc, la dificultad con la que nos encontramos es que se desconoce la enfermedad, que estamos ante una situación de urgencia y de escasez de medios. Y todo eso va a influir en la definición de este parámetro. Vamos a ver uno a uno estos problemas, como digo, para señalar, o como decía, para señalar cuáles son los focos que tenemos que tener en cuenta para medir la lex artis. En primer lugar, si nos centramos en la definición de la lex artis como parámetro general, el primer gran grupo de problemas es identificar cuál es el parámetro o cuál es el estado de la ciencia que tiene que conocer un médico que trata a un enfermo de COVID-19 que puede desconocer válidamente. Pues bien, en este punto la situación es distinta según estemos o según nos encontremos ante la valoración de una actuación médica en los momentos absolutamente iniciales de la pandemia o quizá actualmente. Inicialmente, el conocimiento o el volumen de conocimientos que integraba el estado de la ciencia en relación a la enfermedad COVID-19 era 0. Y paulatinamente ese volumen de conocimientos se ha ido incrementando. Por tanto, en esta situación de pandemia va a ser clave identificar que de la cantidad de publicaciones que ha habido, cuándo se han producido, cuándo se han ido, digamos, incrementando los conocimientos que forman parte del estado de la ciencia, para entonces determinar si la actuación del médico en ese momento tenía o contaba con esos conocimientos ya añadidos al estado de la ciencia o no. Esa avalancha de publicaciones que menciono que se ha producido en un segundo momento es lo que determina que a partir de ese estado inicial de desconocimiento, el fenómeno con el que nos enfrentemos cuando medimos el parámetro general del estado de la ciencia sea otro. Un fenómeno que se caracteriza por la gran variabilidad, mutabilidad o, digamos, rapidez de evolución del estado de la ciencia. Lo que hoy es conocido para la enfermedad, mañana puede ser contradicho. Lo que hoy se dice que es de esta forma, mañana puede ser que se diga de esta otra. Esto es algo que ocurre en general con la lex artis, es decir, la ciencia va evolucionando y la fijación del estado de la ciencia se tiene que ir haciendo conforme va avanzando esta evolución. Pero en este caso de la pandemia del coronavirus está exagerado este fenómeno de la variabilidad, o al menos a día de hoy está exagerado. Llegará un momento, cuando haya pasado más tiempo, en que ya estos saberes, esta avalancha de publicaciones se consolide, se vayan concretando o consolidando determinados saberes y por tanto se vaya integrando más claramente qué es el saber que tiene que manejar cualquier profesional sanitario que se enfrente a la atención de un enfermo con COVID. Hasta entonces, sin embargo, lo que nos encontramos es con una incertidumbre bastante elevada. Una publicación dice que el medicamento A es adecuado para tratar a los enfermos de coronavirus, la publicación siguiente dice que no es adecuado. Otra dice que sí, pero para los enfermos solo con ciertas características. Y eso lleva a que sea difícil identificar realmente cuál es ese estado de la ciencia, porque como digo, no están consolidados todavía los saberes. En estas circunstancias, para lo que sí nos sirve este parámetro de estado de la ciencia o de proliferación actual de publicaciones es para delimitar negativamente qué es lo que no se conoce. Es decir, lo que todavía no haya sido publicado y efectos o relevancia de determinada incidencia de la enfermedad sobre determinados enfermos, etcétera, que no se hayan todavía descubierto, es algo que no tienen por qué saber los médicos, y si su actuación incide en alguno de estos supuestos, su comportamiento no va a ser considerado negligente en ningún caso, porque no entra dentro de lo que es el parámetro de la ciencia. Igualmente, cuando estamos ante teorías contradictorias, generalmente se suele considerar que estos problemas que se llama prácticas de opinión o teorías contradictorias no forman parte de la lex artis. ¿Qué significa esto? Que tan válido es el comportamiento del médico que sigue lo que ha dicho la publicación A, como el comportamiento del médico que sigue lo que ha dicho la publicación contradictoria, porque no se ha establecido cuál de las dos predomina, cuál de las dos se tiene que consolidar. De manera que en ese estadio es bastante el ámbito o el margen de actuación que tienen los profesionales sanitarios. Desde otra perspectiva, la incertidumbre de este estado de la ciencia también influye en qué es lo que tiene que informar el médico al paciente de COVID, es decir, a la hora de pretender aplicar un determinado tratamiento, de qué le tiene que informar cuando puede ser que haya opiniones contradictorias. Pues el médico lo que tendría que hacer es informar de esas opiniones contradictorias y razonar por qué él prefiere la publicación A o la publicación B, básicamente. En todo caso, de lo que no se puede responsabilizar al médico en este nivel de la información es de que no informe de lo que no se sabe. Esto entraría fuera del margen o del ámbito, del parámetro del estado de la ciencia, y sobre esto no es imputable al médico. Es cierto que el paciente tiene un déficit en su autonomía decisoria porque no decide con todos los factores, pero los factores que le faltan para adoptar su decisión no le son imputables al médico, son imputables a fuerza mayor, y es que la ciencia todavía no ha llegado a conocer absolutamente todo de esta enfermedad. El segundo gran grupo de problemas que tiene que ver con la determinación del estado de la ciencia, decía que tiene que estar relacionado con la falta de protocolos. Como sabemos, los protocolos, las guías clínicas, las guidelines, todo eso hace referencia a una serie de documentos que en definitiva lo que tratan es de estandarizar la actuación médica para enfrentarse ante un grupo determinado de casos o un tipo determinado de pacientes en una determinada enfermedad. De manera que son la cristalización o la consolidación de la lex artis para una serie de casos, cristalización que suele llevarse a cabo por grupos de expertos, por sociedades científicas, y que lo que buscan es limitar el margen de incertidumbre al que se enfrenta el profesional sanitario cuando tiene distintas opciones médicas o distintas terapias. El protocolo fija cuál es la más adecuada, y el médico lo que tiene que hacer, en principio, o lo que le propone el protocolo, es seguir una de ellas para resolver un determinado caso. En la situación de pandemia, sin embargo, nos encontramos con que estos protocolos no existen. La situación de novedad, la imprevisión, la falta de consenso, que decía que deriva de las publicaciones contradictorias, lleva a que no existan todavía protocolos. Ojo, me refiero a protocolos de asistencia a enfermos de COVID-19, no protocolos que sí que existen y han proliferado bastante, de limitación del contagio por parte de estos enfermos a profesionales o a otros enfermos. Por ejemplo, hay protocolos de cómo llevar a cabo endoscopias, de cómo aislar a los enfermos de COVID para que no contagien a los profesionales, etc. Pero protocolos de atención concreta de se tiene que proporcionar este medicamento en estas dosis según el tipo de paciente, hasta ahora son más que escasos o no del todo contrastados o no del todo fiables. En estas circunstancias, entonces, dado que los protocolos desde el siglo pasado parece que son la panacea a la hora de definir la lex artis, porque indican qué es lo que tenía que hacer el médico, la situación que nos encontramos es no podemos entonces definir cuál es el parámetro de conducta del profesional sanitario. Era esencial tener un protocolo para poder decir qué es lo que tenía que haber hecho ese médico y si no lo tenemos no sabemos definir cuál era este comportamiento. Bueno, la respuesta es no. La respuesta es no es esencial. No tenemos protocolos, es cierto, pero que no los tengamos no significa que no se va a poder decir qué es lo que tendría que haber hecho o qué es lo que debería haber hecho un médico en la atención a enfermos con COVID en un determinado caso. Y digo que no es esencial porque en general, aunque los protocolos, digamos, o he dicho que cristalizan la lex artis, no la definen de manera excluyente. Hay multitud de actuaciones médicas, de actos médicos que no tienen protocolo y aún así se puede determinar perfectamente por otras vías, por publicaciones, por conferencias, cuál es el parámetro de comportamiento que se ha de adoptar en esos actos médicos. Los protocolos médicos, por otra parte, pueden ser contradictorios. Puede haber varios protocolos para un mismo caso. Los protocolos pueden estar desactualizados. Los protocolos, además, no son vinculantes. Es decir, son orientaciones, pero ni vinculan al juez ni vinculan a los médicos de manera general. Por lo que el hecho de no tener un protocolo no es algo que impida identificar cuál es el comportamiento concreto. Y menos todavía en un contexto como el de la pandemia actual, en el que se ha producido o se produce dentro de un fenómeno que merece la pena destacar. Y es que la pandemia actual se ha manifestado fundamentalmente en un contexto hospitalario. Y me explico. Los pacientes, los que necesitan asistencia más directa de COVID-19, no han sido atendidos generalmente en consultas particulares, sino que han ingresado en hospitales y han sido tratados en hospitales. Y en ese contexto hospitalario es frecuente, cada vez más, es muy habitual en la mayor parte de los países, la actuación en grupo. Actuación en grupo, bien porque se actúen por equipos médicos o bien porque los médicos pongan en común el tratamiento de los pacientes en sesiones clínicas, sobre todo aquellos que más dudas les generan en cuanto a su tratamiento. Por tanto, en este contexto de actuación en grupo, sesiones o equipos médicos, el parámetro de conducta del médico medio, del médico razonable, ya ha quedado fijado por ese consenso del grupo. De manera que va a ser muy complicado, a mi juicio, aunque habría que ver los casos concretos, identificar como negligente el comportamiento de un médico en la atención a un enfermo de COVID cuando ese comportamiento se ha determinado por un equipo médico o en una sesión clínica, ya que el compartir las ideas sobre el tratamiento entre todos los profesionales sanitarios es lo que ha fijado que ese comportamiento sea el que adoptaría un profesional medio. Pasando, y con esto ya avanzo hacia el final, al segundo tipo o al segundo nivel de identificación de la lex artis, del caso concreto, la lex artis ad hoc, decía que las dificultades radicaban fundamentalmente en los tres elementos que definen el caso concreto: el paciente, el tiempo, la situación de urgencia y los medios con los que se ha contado. Si valoramos cómo se ha enfrentado un médico a la atención de un enfermo concreto, el problema que tenía ese médico y que tenemos nosotros para valorar su comportamiento diligente o negligente tiene que ver con el hecho de que la enfermedad era desconocida. Es desconocida y es desconocida en cuanto a sus efectos, en cuanto a su evolución, en cuanto a su tratamiento. Y por eso, en este contexto, valorar como negligente un tratamiento adoptado a un enfermo que a posteriori se demuestra erróneo es complicado, porque lo que hay que plantearse, como decía inicialmente, es ver si a priori ese mismo tratamiento habría sido adoptado por un médico medio. ¿Qué han hecho los médicos en estos casos? Fundamentalmente han ido utilizando el método científico, ensayo y error. Han ido aplicando medicamentos para paliar sintomatología del COVID y en ese sentido, siempre y cuando esa misma decisión de aplicar un medicamento para paliar una sintomatología hubiese sido igualmente adoptada por un médico medio, esa decisión es diligente, aunque a posteriori se demuestre que está contraindicado o que no es adecuado. Solamente de ese error es de lo que se aprende para no repetir este comportamiento en el futuro. Por tanto, en estos casos, no es que valga todo lo que hayan hecho los médicos para tratar de curar a los enfermos de COVID, pero sí es cierto que ante el desconocimiento va a ser difícil, salvo casos muy extremos, identificar como negligente las decisiones adoptadas por los médicos que sean simplemente paliativas de síntomas, por así decirlo. Por otra parte, el contexto en el que se presenta la pandemia se puede pensar que se ha caracterizado a la hora de definir la lex artis como un contexto de urgencia, decisiones rápidas. La urgencia efectivamente se caracteriza por esa situación en la que el profesional sanitario tiene que adoptar una decisión sin tiempo suficiente para la reflexión o para conseguir base científica sobre la que apoyar esa decisión por pruebas médicas, porque el resultado de tratar al enfermo antes o después varía sensiblemente. En esa situación de urgencia, normalmente se suele admitir que el parámetro de conducta, los deberes del médico se rebajan, porque no tienen tiempo para pensar, no tienen tiempo para reflexionar, no tienen tiempo para adoptar o pedir pruebas médicas. Si esta fuese la situación en la pandemia, a la hora de valorar los actos médicos realizados sobre enfermos de COVID, tendríamos que tener en cuenta esa imprevisión. Pero hay que puntualizar que la urgencia no necesariamente es una característica de la pandemia. Es decir, la pandemia lleva ya 6 u 8 meses, según como contemos, y a lo largo de ese tiempo ha podido haber situaciones de urgencia. El enfermo que está en una situación de paro, en una situación de falta de oxigenación, necesita respirador ya, pero otras en las que la situación ha sido estable y se han podido adoptar decisiones pausadas. Por tanto, la pandemia no necesariamente es sinónimo de urgencia. Ha podido haber situaciones de urgencia, pero no una situación de pandemia equivale a una situación de urgencia. Una situación de pandemia realmente a lo que equivale es a lo que se llama una situación de, ya lo mencionaba antes, de medicina de catástrofe. La medicina de catástrofe, más que por razón de la urgencia que se puede producir, se suele caracterizar por la situación de deficiencia de medios, la situación de falta de personal humano y la situación de escasez de recursos. Y en esas circunstancias, la calidad del servicio que se puede prestar es sin duda inferior, pero no, como digo, por urgencia, sino por razón de la catástrofe. Esta situación de escasez de medios humanos y materiales influye y se tiene que tener muy presente tanto para la valoración de la lex artis del tratamiento de los enfermos de COVID-19 como de cualquier otro enfermo. Cuando decía que la razón de la asistencia prestada radicaba en que no se le había podido proporcionar el medio o el personal que le habría atendido mejor. Es decir, lo que aquí hay que plantearse es, no estando en un contexto de urgencia, el médico debe pararse y reflexionar qué necesita este enfermo en vista de la sintomatología que presenta. Y con su criterio médico adoptará la decisión, necesita X. Si resulta que ese X no se le puede proporcionar por una situación de escasez de medios materiales o humanos, entonces es cuando esa circunstancia no le es imputable al médico. Ese paciente se ha visto efectivamente afectado por la situación de pandemia, ha recibido efectivamente una atención inferior o inadecuada, pero ese defecto de atención no le es imputable al médico, porque el médico no está en su ámbito de control disponer de esa pluralidad de medios humanos o medios materiales con los que poder afrontar la atención adecuada de ese enfermo. El médico no. Ahora veremos si alguien más, pero el médico, como digo, no es el responsable de esa situación de escasez y, por tanto, a la hora de valorar la lex artis ad hoc, insisto, cuando la causa de la deficiencia en la atención sea la escasez de medios, no se le puede imputar al médico. Esto mismo tendríamos que tenerlo en cuenta en las circunstancias en las que el médico ha tenido que destinar los medios a un enfermo o a otro, y que por el hecho de destinarlo a uno, otro se ha visto perjudicado o infraatendido. No me refiero necesariamente a las situaciones de triaje, pero sí un poco a esa idea de que lo que va para uno no va para el otro. El médico, aunque haya adoptado una decisión de darle los medios a uno en vez de al otro, aunque esa decisión posteriormente se pueda plantear como errónea porque se demuestre de alguna forma que el paciente que no ha recibido los medios habría podido obtener una curación que no ha obtenido el paciente que sí los recibe, aunque estemos ante esa situación, el médico tampoco va a responder por esas decisiones, sino ya porque las consideremos diligentes, conforme a lo que decía, de que no es responsable el médico en esas condiciones, sí por la idea del estado de necesidad. El estado de necesidad es una causa de antijuricidad que puede justificar la atención a uno de los bienes en vez de al otro. Con esto que voy a decir ahora concluyo. El médico, digo, no es responsable por esta situación de escasez de medios. Lo que nos tenemos que plantear es, ¿y la institución sanitaria, pública o privada que está detrás? Pues aquí inicialmente podríamos responder probablemente sí, porque en este caso, cuando nos estamos planteando personas jurídicas, no se habla del parámetro de la lex artis, de un parámetro subjetivo, sino objetivo. Lo que pasa es que lo que hay que determinar es si también para estas instituciones públicas o privadas el hecho de la pandemia actúa como causa de fuerza mayor. Es decir, la pandemia se ha desatado, era imprevisible, una vez que es imprevisible es inevitable además, y podríamos plantearnos si tampoco las instituciones sanitarias que no disponían de esos medios técnicos o humanos van a responder por esa idea de la fuerza mayor. Hay un autor que se llama Domènech, un autor español, Domènech Pascual, que plantea, sin embargo, una idea, y es la fuerza mayor puede justificar el inicio de la pandemia y el no tener medios técnicos y humanos al inicio. Pero una vez que la pandemia se desata y empieza a desarrollarse, es posible que las decisiones posteriores de estas instituciones públicas o privadas, comprar más medios, contratar más personal, no hacerlo, esas sí puedan ser valoradas, en su caso, desde la perspectiva de la responsabilidad y no quedar amparadas por el criterio de la fuerza mayor. Con esto, esperando no haber aburrido demasiado a la audiencia, concluyo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Andrea, por este interesante que plantea temas de debate probablemente cuando la post-pandemia, ¿no? Cuando probablemente, dices tú, pueden estar aumentando las posibilidades de acciones de responsabilidad civil médica. Yo tengo una consulta que te hago desde mi parte. ¿Qué opinión te merece una estrategia distinta que podría ser la que han desarrollado países como algunos estados de los Estados Unidos, de establecer mecanismos de responsabilidad limitada o responsabilidad acotada o inmunidades de responsabilidad, ¿no? Estas liability protection, precisamente para evitar las incertidumbres de que la responsabilidad sea acotada por la lex artis caso a caso y genere de alguna manera una conducta siempre duditativa, porque no está garantizado un actuar médico en circunstancias de medicina de emergencia. Y así el Estado de Nueva York lo planteó, si hayan sacado guía en esta materia, han promovido sacar legislación y pareciera que hay muchos estados en los Estados Unidos que funcionan con esos mecanismos. Entonces, me interesa conocer tu opinión respecto de este tipo de legislaciones de inmunidad.
Bueno, ese tipo de legislaciones también, por ejemplo, en España en algún momento se han conocido, por ejemplo, con el problema que hubo en la colza hace muchos años. Al final fue el Estado el que decidió que daba subsidios y de alguna forma paliaba la situación de este tipo de enfermos. Son decisiones políticas, a fin de cuentas. Es decir, se trata de que desde el Estado se decida, desde los órganos legislativos, se decida en quién cargar el riesgo de estos daños que a fin de cuentas han sufrido los pacientes. Cuanto más público o cuanto más conciencia de lo público exista en un Estado, más se tenderá a los subsidios estatales. Cuanto más tienda hacia lo privado, se tenderá hacia la responsabilidad, aunque efectivamente para no cargar excesivamente las espaldas de los profesionales sanitarios con limitaciones en cuanto a las cuantías, pero como digo, es una decisión que tiene que ver con el modelo de Estado que se tenga. Efectivamente es válida, son decisiones que es cierto que lo que de alguna forma evitan es precisamente esta discusión que yo pongo de relieve, que es ver caso por caso, que cada juez tenga que ir determinando si hubo o no negligencia. En cierto modo, para los médicos, cuando se opta por una responsabilidad pero limitada, pero responsabilidad objetiva, digamos que es en cierto modo un poco injusto, en la medida en que ellos no hayan actuado contrariamente a las artis. De todas formas, este tipo de limitaciones se suelen imponer sobre personas jurídicas, sobre instituciones hospitalarias, que digamos que tienen menos corazón y por tanto es menos arriesgado cargarles con este tipo de responsabilidad.
Aquí tengo otra pregunta aquí del público, de Laura Puentes, que plantea, dice ella, que bueno, en estos casos se han justificado de manera individual tales procedimientos por el principio de beneficencia, y luego señala, en estos casos, casi como en un acto de experimentación científica, si hay consecuencias adviertas, pregunta ella, ¿es posible atribuir responsabilidad médica?
Bueno, ahí hay un tema y es algo mencionaba en lo que he comentado anteriormente, que tiene que ver con, no existen, el médico se ha encontrado con que no tenía un saber contrastado de cómo tratar la enfermedad y ha ido buscando, con los recursos y conocimientos que tenía, ha ido buscando posibles curas. Lo que pasa es que en ocasiones se ha dado un paso más. No se ha buscado solo paliar síntomas, sino intentar atajar e ir a la base y ya no guiarse por un medicamento que palie el síntoma, sino que busque la causa. Y ahí el límite con la actuación del médico y un ensayo clínico es muy tenue. Y en la medida en que el médico realmente, de manera sistemática, haya aplicado un determinado tipo de medicamento con ese objetivo de curar la enfermedad, podríamos estar pensando si realmente lo que ha llevado a cabo no es un ensayo clínico, y en la medida en que ese tipo de ensayos está generalmente, en la mayor parte de los ordenamientos, regulado y limitado en cuanto a cómo hacerlo, con qué garantías, con qué procedimiento, podríamos encontrarnos no ya ante una responsabilidad, que eventualmente también, sino ante las sanciones propias del incumplimiento de las normas que regulan los ensayos clínicos.
Tengo una última pregunta del público, de Alexander Gómez, que dice, ¿cómo puede esta, en relación a los puestos, relacionarse en los escenarios de territorios indígenas, en el marco de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas indicados por la ONU? Es decir, los temas del ex arti, entiendo, relacionados, aplicados a población indígena.
No sé muy bien si la pregunta va dirigida a circunstancias particulares que tenga la población indígena en cuanto a su genotipo, o si va indicado a la reducción todavía mayor de medios técnicos y humanos que existen en ese tipo de contextos. No sé, Juan Alberto, ¿cómo lo interpretas tú?
¿Cómo se aplicaría o se valoraría la lex artis en concreto en la atención de poblaciones que son indígenas? Así que si es posible que Alexander pueda precisar mejor.
Yo pienso que también está vinculado con el tema de los derechos diferenciados de los pueblos indígenas. ¿cierto? De sus propias cosmologías también, de sus propias costumbres, culturas, si estas epistemologías del ex artis podrían ser aplicadas o serían, en el fondo, digamos, implausibles en ese escenario. Me da la impresión de que por ahí va también la pregunta.
Se discutió el hecho de la atención de el morir dignamente de pacientes de poblaciones indígenas que tienen otras formas culturales de vivir el proceso de morir. Entonces, yo entiendo cómo se aplicaría la responsabilidad médica en el ex artis en el caso concreto de las culturas diversas, ¿no?
Bueno, en tanto que en el estadio o en el nivel de definición de la ex artis del caso concreto, la ad hoc, tiene que tener en cuenta las circunstancias del paciente, las circunstancias de las personas. Efectivamente, habrá que valorar si ante las determinadas circunstancias de ese tipo de paciente, ese paciente indígena, con ese folclore, con esa cultura, con esa ética, la actuación del médico ha sido acorde a esas determinadas circunstancias. Aunque ahí, claro, ahí ya depende, aquí sí que es una cuestión regional o es una cuestión de cada país, en qué medida prima o no por encima de esas circunstancias culturales y religiosas la protección de los derechos fundamentales. Por ejemplo, en España, que nos encontramos con la situación, no digo que es análoga, pero algo me recuerda a esto de los testigos de Jehová, fundamentalmente se puede intervenir judicialmente para primar el derecho a la salud y el derecho a la vida por encima de esas convicciones religiosas en determinadas circunstancias. Entonces, bueno, ahí habría que valorar si está bien la doctrina la que existe con los pueblos indígenas.
Alberto, aquí hay una última para no dejarla en el aire. Es de Luis Guillermo Bastidas. La felicita primero que todo por su ilustrativa ponencia. Y frente a la temática que usted ha planteado, él quiere saber si en su criterio, ¿qué debería seguirse o priorizarse por parte de los profesionales de la salud en el marco de la relación médico-paciente para tomar decisiones acertadas en tiempos de pandemia?
¿Qué debería primarse?
Pues, claro, dice primarse o priorizarse o criterio seguir.
Los médicos siempre creo que lo que tienen que priorizar es la salud del enfermo, de manera que lo que tienen que intentar es la mejor atención del enfermo que están atendiendo. Y eso quizá no, es algo que digo rápidamente y que a lo mejor habría que reflexionar algo más, pero el médico tiene que ocuparse del enfermo que está atendiendo. No se le puede exigir una visión de conjunto del mejor bien o el mayor bien para el conjunto de los enfermos. El médico va caso a caso y eso es lo que tiene que atender en cada momento.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Ya estamos en el tiempo de cerrar nuestra primera parte del webinar. Te agradezco mucho tu participación. Estos son temas todavía que estamos trabajando, ¿no? Vienen, ¿no? Y así que, bueno, vamos a dar Erick va a dar tú la...
Sí. Bueno, claro, agradecer a Andrea, muchísimas gracias por sumarte a esta excelente conferencia. Hasta ahora vamos muy bien, con muy buena participación y excelentes intervenciones. Te agradecemos tu participación, haber aceptado la invitación y también tu excelente intervención. Muchísimas gracias. Y darles nomás al público las gracias también por estar presente y acompañándonos. Y nos vamos a encontrar entonces a las 2 de la tarde, hora de New York. Esto es más o menos en 1 hora y 10 minutos más, o sea, en 70 minutos más nos reencontramos para la jornada de la tarde. Entonces, nos vemos.